Ala sala. Ta ini tereng aran zoge ini jobja de kangresena chigdog lamcher segno chigdog lamcher. Chigdog lamcher sena ta ngaran zoge yang ngato chigbo chona. 참참라 되네 찍보 좋나 양 ngazu tela any chöki zong matopna tangzeng je matopna yang any nyora chabo chabo chando ya jega yang samsamna tene dukbo chane ta dukbo yena dewi chang yang ngara zo donghar te sola sosu ge chi yani ta yang tangzeng je nim sosu ge je matopa yena tene ngazu ma any 마 타라 롱로야 직 드리지 용거래 드리지 송자데 다 가츠 그직 내도 가래 좋나양 근데 때라 가츠지 에네 냠레 예나양레 레가 예나양레 근데 소소게 샘긴 로당데 지과제 토바 예나다 띵가서 람칠생인데 아니 드리지라 데네 라고여서레스
So the subject that I'm addressing tonight is known in Tibetan as Chiduk Lamcher, which literally means carrying happiness and suffering on the path. So what the principle that's at work here is, in order to give us means to relate to and skillfully work with any and all situations that arise. If things that we deem to be good, that make us happy, are happening to us, there is the possibility that we'll get carried away with that and not be able to work skillfully with the situation, but just end up with what turns out to be quite problematic, because the happiness the circumstances producing the happiness tend to overwhelm us. On the other hand, if we encounter some situation or some event that harms us, causes us suffering or sorrow, then again, if we're not able to transform that experience in some effective way and relate to it in some skillful manner, it can just get worse and worse, compounding itself. So the point behind carrying happiness and suffering on the path, which is the actual title of this text, is that regardless of what occurs, whether it is a happy state or an unhappy state in our lives, and this could refer to something that takes place in your spiritual practice, in your daily life, in your work, any kind of positive or negative occurrence, it's a way of working with our minds to be able to relate skillfully with those. And that is called carrying something on the path, to be able to incorporate it in a positive or a productive way into our experience, regardless of the circumstances. Lasso?
라소라 ene ta tren de la yang ngazu ji ani ji do lam cher ge pecha che yang ngazu tena mata ene ji thade zo ye yobre
Lasso?
ta ti ingela jor yo sare ina yang ta zobo te tren ngaran zogma ene ta karse gora ta ngaran zogi nyamnyong rawo chena tene zobo ta tsar de rawo chi tene tene chi chene pache ani shuna ta chi keme che minro samgo yos
Lasso? Now, it's true that we do have a text that this teaching is based upon, and there is available an English translation that people will have available to them. But rather than simply go line by line through the text, Rinpoche said, even though there is the English translation, it seems to me it would be more profitable, from my perspective, Rinpoche said, to speak a bit more from the point of view of my own experience, of how we can all personally experience these teachings, rather than simply go mechanically through the book.
la so la ta de la teni ta ngara to tambo de na la ta ani jiren zele ya ani chober job chi do ene ta pa kwa jiren za wang ju sengen de je dang ge ene chang chob sam ba ta ene ngara zo ge ning je ge la se ge ya bi bre tende je song za de ta rang ni yena ene tape chagana tene 상지 기대 공방라고 오늘 제 차나양 되네 상 맞이네 되네 샘제 탐제 근데 당아도 상 맞이가 봐도 샘제 이제 더 코나 로비악 되네 페나탈 룩즈타부게 샘제 제네
Mm.
어다 드레시 쟁해제 임바 송장세 다테다 제네서 어조스 담보 뭐브르지 히바이나 된다고 제르스 내가 요래
Awesome.
다 ngazu 제렌zel라 양 ngazu 차 차바스는 소 제렌zel라 가르세 토니보다 가르치는 ngazu 드롭 투거래 제렌zel라 토 무니바다 가르치는 용거래서나 아다 되네 드레지 ngazu 양 르제 지멜링 바가 드레지 송요스 강라 펜바 드롭나테 제비 토로 펜그래
Uh-huh.
심지어 강라 때네 너바지나테 제비 토라 때네 너바레스 Tene sanji korana tene tege garese goroko yente yo marwa tene dedo. Tene sonzang tene nga da simpye dedo tsungba yin songba na yin. Ene ta nga tsuge ene tuje chenpo la tene te cheba te yang kandar ta cha tsawa se na tuje chenpo la ta che goba che te yang yen la penpa domna tuje chenpo la 토라 페마다 얘는 너바치나 토제 첨보라 드네 가서 토라 미니버 드로버레 드네지 송사도 드네 나란 소거야 대나이게 드네 옌페지 드로 드네 얘네데 빵바이나 다 대드네 토제 첨보라 얘네 쳐바 페바세나 토니비기 쳐바 데레스 당보 대슈긴스
Awesome. So the first point I want to make, Rinpoche said, is about the homage in the text. And the text begins with a formal homage to the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, or in Tibetan Chenrezig, the Bodhisattva of compassion, sometimes referred to as the deity who is the epitome of the compassion of all Buddhas. And the reason that this invocation is significant in this text is because in calling upon and paying homage to Avalokiteshvara as the epitome of compassion, we are called upon by the author to recall the kind of motivation that we all as practitioners need to adopt, what is often called the shepherd-like motivation of bodhicitta. Just as a shepherd herds his flocks ahead of him through the gate into the corral at night to keep them safe, so a bodhisattva pledges to work for the benefit of all beings until all beings have attained enlightenment. So the emphasis is not simply upon you yourself attaining Buddhahood, but rather upon striving to benefit all beings until all beings, without exception, attain Buddhahood. And this is what is embodied in Avalokiteshvara. So in paying homage to Avalokiteshvara, it brings up the question, well, if we were to pose the question, what would delight Avalokiteshvara more than anything? Or, alternatively, what would disappoint Avalokiteshvara more than anything? Jigme Lingpa said very pithily, whatever you do to benefit others brings delight to the minds of the victorious ones, the Buddhas. Whatever you do to harm others upsets the minds of the victorious ones. It's that simple. And so given that we are all, as ordinary beings, in the same situation with the kind of joys and sorrows that we experience, in opening his text by paying reverence, paying homage to Avalokiteshvara, our author, the third Dodorchen, is reminding us that if we seek to live up to that example that is embodied in Avalokiteshvara, to the extent that our actions and energies and so forth are directed towards benefiting others, we are, in a sense, delighting Avalokiteshvara. So it's an encouragement in this invocation at the very outset of the text for us to understand the importance of us always dedicating our efforts as practitioners and as beings to benefiting others. Awesome.
라소나 다 딘데지 송장 에네 다 가서 이니 베나 다 파파 이니 게레제 라소바 너나 얘네 상제다 장초 숨바 대남장 아니 짜침본제야 얘네 대나긴 직대가 토르이나 다 나랑 저거지 햄바다 대와기 얘네 지다 가서 얘네 용약 대침보티 얘네 가르쳐가 요랬으나 얘네 다 가서 semba zambochi chadega yore, semba zambochi. Da mdorna tene, da rinken tada nga so nangba geyina, da rinken changkyobji seniti, tene tsoho pena, yenpen ke sambachi. Da ti ching yoba yina, yen la penba, rang la penba, jarwa nyeba, da tamche tene drop to yachi, yin sares.
So for us then, who are receiving these teachings, when we begin by showing honor to and respecting the exalted Avalokiteshvara or any and all of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas as epitomes of such qualities, then we start to see the value, even in an ordinary secular context, of a very noble and altruistic attitude on our part being the real cause of all benefit and happiness in this world. Now, we speak in the Buddhist teachings about precious bodhicitta, the precious awakening attitude of a bodhisattva, but that is rooted in altruism. It is rooted in the concern for the welfare of others and the sincere desire and attempt to bring benefit to others through one's actions. So when we have that kind of noble and positive motivation, that altruistic motivation, it's really a win-win situation. Others benefit, we benefit, and as well, the Buddhas are delighted. So it is a win-win situation. Awesome.
Hola sola, da nga so njikten ba chegi, nga so njikten ki thola, tene changme ge beson che ate, me zangpo chi che ya singe chigi, samlo chi yode jere mato, me ngenpa chi che ge samba chi yo samares. Da, da me zangpo singe de, tanda khanre che le ngoye zong gogo yo na, da zangpo se de, Ani ta nga ran zo ga pena ta nga zo million de mambo yoro pena ta chi nga zo kare se ne shi yon den dang tene pena sherab dang te nang yin ga pena gyo dang nor dang tene zog dang lang zo dang tene dra mi de yoro ta te so
Uh-huh.
yin na yang ta ti nang ne ji ne ta nga zo zangbo senge ngune ge mi zangbo senge de ta ya bo chi sang lo ta na senpa zangbo ji go do
Mm.
다 가래 여장 선바 독자지 얘나 되네 가서 애니 가서 또 비연아yan드라 연대 연아yan드라 되네 롱교 연아yan드라 되네 직 가서 베디 랑더 도베야 깔야 갖고 얘한테 지게야 다 될 것도 미 되네 가서 베 연다 부섬 쪽바 여바 선바 독자지 여바 얘나 되네 디 애네 rāngyā māchikpa, yēnlāyā māchikpa, tēne pēne tēne lōjī māngbō yore pēne tā jitēngi tōs pēne tē rāwa kō wāng chēn, tōp chēn, tā tē rāwa tē sō kē tēne chēk tā jitēng mēdē bāda, nō bāda, tēne māngbō chē zōngyē tē sō tam chē tōm jōr yō jō, yōng tēn yō jō, chirikpa drā mēdā chab tōngyē, tēne yāng nō bā chēn bō chēngē tē sō kē chēk tō
Now, I think it's safe to say, Rinpoche said, that in this world, we as individuals would like to think that we are, or certainly want to be, good people. I don't think anybody really consciously thinks, I want to be a bad person. We all have this idea of, I want to be a very good person, a very fine person. But what do we mean by that when we really identify what is a fine person, a good person? There are all kinds of different qualities and characteristics that we can assign to people that for one reason or another might be considered good, such as having an education, being very intelligent. For some people, it might be a good thing to have lots of wealth or power and influence, to be very handsome or beautiful, to be young and healthy. But if we really think about what it means to be a good person, surely what it means is to have a good and noble motivation. That's the real defining characteristic that makes a person a good person. Because a person can have all those other possessions and qualities and so forth, but if they have a very, very bad attitude, no matter how educated they are, no matter how rich they are, no matter how powerful they are, all they end up doing is creating problems for themselves and others if it isn't rooted in an altruistic concern for the benefit of others. And we can call to mind any number of examples from history of people who were very powerful, very rich and so forth, and just created a lot of destruction, a lot of problems for themselves and others, despite having all those seemingly good qualities, because they lack that one essential that really makes a good person, that noble and positive attitude, that altruistic motivation.
나서라. 근데 당아주 샘상고 세도 제도 값서 다 강들 샘데 나주게 샘데 제나 소바 드람이다지 최용고요래. 근데지 송자 나주 지고 존나양 지고 대람 얘네 당아랑 저거 지 람드 체토바다 도보 존나야 도보데 람드 체토바 지도 가래 존나야 나주 빼나데니 다 양원도 만로와 딱다 제토바 제야데 당가랑 조고베나 배체모지 임바레스.
And in order for us as individuals to cultivate that noble quality of mind, among all the different methods and so forth that are available to us, one of the most important, one of the most fundamental, is the ability to relate skillfully and productively to all of the joys and sorrows of our lives. So that when we experience states of happiness and enjoyment, we're able to, quote, carry those on the path. We're able to work skillfully and productively with those. On the other hand, if we experience pain or sufferings or setbacks, we're able as well to carry those on the path. So the point here is that regardless of what occurs in our individual experience, without falling under the sway of those circumstances, we're able to work with and relate to those circumstances in a way that is completely productive and productive of that noble quality of mind. That is the really important issue that we're discussing here.
올라서라. 다 데라 강들 때니 노르나 다 동하 람드 체서도 기보 람드 체서 니 세트니 되지. 얘네 다 송고도 근데 송장 다 당부 찍고도 높은 생에데 양 뭐송야데 개침보 인사레스 찍고서는 아래를 써야돼 높은서는 가래를 써야 돼.
So in that regard, our author, Dr. Jigmetembe Nima, says that there are two parts to his discussion: how to use suffering as the path and how to use happiness as the path. Now, having said that, we first need to identify what is he actually talking about when he uses terms like suffering and happiness. What constitutes the quality of happiness? What constitutes the quality of suffering? So if we're going to talk about carrying both of those on the path, we need to understand what it is we're carrying in the first place. We need to define our terms. Also.
라서라. 다 강한테 찍고도 높은 생인데요. 되니 아주 샘지. 되니 아주 샘지다 남도 찍기. 아니 다 아주 찍 아니 저조지 마도 랑잉기 야야 때 깔래 갖고 지래도스.
Mhm. And when it comes right down to it, what we define as individuals as happiness or suffering is more a question of what our way of thinking makes the situation, rather than it's much more difficult for us to say this particular set of circumstances is inherently a happy set of circumstances or a painful set of circumstances. It has far more to do with how our mind works with and misinterprets or interprets circumstances as happy or sad, happy or painful. Also.
근데 다 요라 때네 지도 요야 돼. 요라 때네. 페르나 요르 찍라 네 댕게 그 메찍라.
Mm.
강바 찍노는 네 댕게 그 침상 그 메찍라 자이야나.
Mm.
그래봐.
Yeah.
다 강바 때라 다 ngaso me khashige khangba de halepe chiboda gabocho khashige tela hachang tene chibo meba chorde ya
Mm-hmm.
yani der drabo chege ta pena ani karese gorko ta tena yeng pena longba yena da chala drabo yena da ta ngarang su chege thola me nying ta de kapso tene chowa den ragamindo khashige chibo choya de
Mm-hmm.
khashige dukya cho penata khashige longba ta ngaso dela ene halebe ke penata mindawe na chipa chikyang
Mm-hmm.
pena ngaran zoga ene khashige pe halebe ke chik ene tata yakbo choya de khashige dobo chorde ba khashige dobo chowa de khashige yakbo chorde ba tene dire chende ta je de tele tene ngeba je tene zawani ne tene ya to mi no as.
Mm-hmm. If we take the case of people who share a common environment, let's just say we're talking about a group of family members who all live in the same house. They all have the same place of residence. But among those individuals, there may be some who actually love the place. They think it's a very comfortable, nice home, and they really enjoy living there. Whereas others can't stand the place and can't wait to get out of it. They really don't like being in that place. It's not the circumstances per se. The house is the same house. It's how the individuals are interpreting it either as a very pleasant place to be or a very unpleasant place to be. And so it's more a question of how our feelings and sensations and perceptions as individuals vary rather than the circumstances themselves. Because in any given situation or set of circumstances, one individual may be perfectly content there, another may be very upset and discontent. Somebody else, pardon me, may be completely indifferent. Pardon me, completely indifferent to that. So we really can't we can't unilaterally say, we can't unilaterally say that a given set of circumstances always produce happiness, always produce suffering. It just isn't like that. It's how we interpret them. Also.
라소라 tene de na yinge ene tata ngarange ene tayang karese gore gabo cheya de sani yang mgawa chandoya tene yakhyole te sani ne yang nga so mgawa chehyole chane tene ge chorwa dewa de sani yang dongaran jordowa.
Another thing to take into consideration is that even for me as an individual, something that I take great delight in today might be something that really disappoints or upsets me tomorrow. Something I consider to be the best of all possible choices today can seem like the worst. So something that creates happiness for me on one occasion can, on another occasion, cause me pain, cause me suffering, cause me unhappiness.
이 마치 되게 깨지게래야 나선 요런롱에 차대도 빼나 애네 다당가랑 게 빼나 치스르다 ngarang la ta chor karse. Jibo jenge chorwa tene ta jihyu jenge nge tene kala je yorwa.
Oh, that,
Dayang dada ge la tene te ta ko nga so jibo je ya ge ta ji yina tene kache seba yina ya nga la ya dewa de jiba chet rogora.
so,
Yina ya tata teise je yang ko so tene ta nga te dewa de jibo je ya re se no mando seba yina tata rand tene trogo na Nyangma shor, chokpa shor yang donghar cha rodwa.
and that's not all because circumstances can change in a heartbeat, very, very quickly. For example, suppose you sit down in front of a plate of your favorite food, your favorite dish, and nothing gives you greater pleasure than to eat that food. So it would make logical sense that the more you eat of that, the happier you're going to be. So you eat and you eat and you eat and you eat and you eat more and more and more of your favorite food until you throw up or until your stomach is completely bursting and you're in pain. So something that started off seeming fine when carried to an extreme turns out to be quite the opposite. And it can happen very quickly.
Wala so ta, one te rawo chegi tini ta ngaran so ge pena ta, eni dedok la supe tini dikhi so tamche yang, eni kechi chegi chegi ta ngaro treng, nyende sanyi dralan jon roya, sanyi ge drade, khatang ge drade treng nyelan jon roya, tini nga so kechi chegi ko pe, eni tata nga so chik dok singe te yang, Metempa, keje chelen jorde di yob, jordro di yob chiret has.
Mm-hmm. So this being the case, when we speak of happiness and suffering as a kind of a compound, we're really not talking about things. We're talking about a process of change in how we relate to things that can happen moment by moment. In fact, does happen by moment by moment. So that a person we take to be a good friend might, in very short order, become someone we think of as our enemy or someone really opposed to us, or vice versa. So when we speak of happiness and suffering, we're not talking about things. We're talking about a constant, moment by moment change in our perception of circumstances, some of which seem to us to be pleasant and conducive to happiness, and some of which seem to be the opposite and conducive of suffering. So it's a process of change we're talking about when we talk about happiness and suffering, so to speak, as a unit.
Derden teni ngaran zu dedok sengen te yang, yorju tola chik teni yaya de kala kabura gas. Te tam che,
Abraham.
sobo teni ngaran zu ge, semgi tola, teni ta rale debachi.
Mm. And again, when we speak about happiness and suffering, it's very, very difficult for us to assign those qualities to any particular object of our experience. It's more a question of our thought processes, the processes in our minds that define what happiness or suffering is, not the object itself or the circumstances themselves, but how the mind is interpreting. Also?
Da, digi toni, bena ngaran rang, nyamnyong toni, sheba yina, teni chi karsa eni rapcho tuben raw chire. Perna teni, eni, da, ngaran raw chi yina, da chi, eni, lo chungchong kapsa ta pena, eni, teni ne ta pe kangaridang, eni teni halebi ki teni chi, mangbo nyang yung he, nyang deng he.
Mm.
Pena ta ngaran zog tate ene ki ngoto chaba na yire. Lo ta yusom kyu ki tende ki tone tene ma ene zang hang tende la tsune. Tene donghara dang kanga tende tse mepa rabo. Tene nyang yunghe chi yens.
Let me introduce a very personal note here, Rinpoche said. So this is something I can speak to from my own experience. Because in my younger life, as many of you know, I underwent a great deal of hardship. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with my circumstances, suffice it to say that when I was about 13 or 14, I was thrown into a communist prison camp. And it was an extremely difficult life with a great deal of hardship and suffering. So from quite an early age, I was subjected to what we could say were very, very painful circumstances, very difficult circumstances. Also,
알았어. 다 딘지 제게 되네 값소 다 가서 수이 찍 가서 애니 강한테 가르래세나 다 가서 지 르지 강해 애니 다 사야 통야 매바 랑왕 매바 애니 다 가서 차
Yeah, I
애니 대소 담지 그 제가서 수이 강해지래도 와 대리 채와데 가르도세나 난게 다 빼는 가서 다 대라지 먹어봐야야
hmm
Reva, ta nga tsu chik pe na teni, ta nanga chik pa semje toni. Teni chik nga tsu ta dra yu dushi ki toni. Teni pe, tela ta nga tsu megawa tang, eni shedang tang, kongcho tang. Teni ki teni chinang nida wo chik nyamla dom yung pe kapso,
hmm
teni nga rangi neyor te yang, nyarwa ngon som drawo ki tsorwan drawo chik chen roko dos. Yes.
hmm So during that time of my imprisonment, when I was first thrown into prison, of course, on an external level, I suffered a lot of physical hardship. We were not given very much to eat or drink. I was quite hungry and thirsty all the time. I was worked hard. I had no freedom to do anything I wanted. So there were those external circumstances, but even worse than that was the effect it had at that time on my mind, because I was extremely upset and angry at the people who were doing this to me. I regarded them as my hated enemies, and I felt so much anger and resentment towards them. So with the coming together of the difficult circumstances externally and the even more difficult circumstances internally, I felt at a certain point that I was in a hell on earth, that I was in a really hellish situation. Awesome.
얘기 다 김선의 가르스나다 나랑기 대탐지기 강거리다 동har긴 용어때 yor 마송레게 되니 다 가서 예 코나라 다치 삼로 당겨 열와
Mm.
근데 된다고 인상 되니 될라야 되니 다동양 야 가세기 되나 잉기 얘네 삼로 당바이나 대체기 다 콜어야 체도 줘야다 강을 체도 줘야 되니라고 지래샤
Mm.
근데 손당 다 나랑 저배 된들라 빼다 아니 어담 먹어봤더니 쇼크침보 제고요
Mm.
얘네 네 값서 지나다 나서고 배 아니 나랑 그 다다 라마 예 저거 어제 챔죠 얘네 콩게 니마 찔렀더니 나라 송호도 얘네 다 저랑 그 되니 제 레가양 약보 메제 얘네 콩초야 첨보제 다 들으스 제는 저 저랑 그 배는 레가도 소야 요제 약보 메제 들으스 제가도 서가도 레베송도 제야 되니 때 연다 인스 어떻게 제가요스 때 가르에서 저 콩초 제가요베스 되니 고소요 어떻게 콩초 제가요스 아니 다 뒤에 값을 되니 콩가라 아니 되니 저랑 때라 아니 가르세고라 다 나타니 고소 잘 메가와치 데 거라다 잘 메가와치 다 나서 그렇지 인디스 제 되니 배삼로 되니 제가요스도 아니 콩고 되니 송도 아카세 닝게 송도 저 아카 닝게스 아니 저랑 되니 다다 나서 이니 리 줌리 생인데 킬랭거 요베송도 대다다 나랑 빼다 인다 인스 나리 줌리 킬랭거 요선 대다다 나랑 그 직배 직 건조를 이체제 줌리는 킬랭제 요삼바다지 요래 요다 요선 가테 나서라 랑라 쩐데 싸니 매바이나 근데 직 나서 얘기 다 빼는 참아지 동섬 달라오네 나서는 너바시 제 두레베 송도 대때 대양 나서는 뭐마 그 지제제 요대바베
Awesome.
나서 드니 된제제 송도 값서 다 대기 토니 애니 다 얘기 좀 찍고 많이 봐다 대기 빼다 랑가양 레다오지 요 삼반다오지 랑가 레드 장가요 삼반다지인데 할리비테 페노 쳔모르도
Uh-huh.
베나다 쫀데 미타보 초 연다지 찍고를 마대 봐 양 빼는 아란소 빼 애니 초 yenda chekni rang ta chek any led pa jango yo se to ka so pena nga so mi chela blonda wadi cha de yo na
Hmm.
any blonda sholdo de ta nge pe sha de zone de kangar chi yo te yang 초 yenda chekni nga blonda me ba song do yo ba song sa ta nga rang ko pe de che se drive yo ba chi sam de zone
Hmm.
tinji ki tene chek nga so sem no chowa che la tene ti ma che ba ge tene ta yang song do chu ki ta pe na any ta pe na ore ta tambo che che jor
So the reason behind all of this suffering that I was feeling was because I was thinking only of the external circumstances and putting all of the blame there and just obsessing about that. And so all I could think about was how difficult my circumstances were. And the more I thought about it, the worse it got. And so the reason I was so unhappy and so upset and so enraged and so furious was because I was focusing in the wrong way. And at that point, my kind Lama, who I was taught by in prison, took Orjim Chemchok. One point, it said to me, he said to me, I've been hearing that you're really having a very bad time here. You're not working well with others, and you're very angry all the time. Is this true? I said, yeah, that's definitely the case. Yes, I'm very angry all the time. And he said, what makes you angry? He said, well, I said to him, I'm furious with our Chinese prison guards, with the communist guards who are imprisoning us and imposing this on us. I hate them. And his response was remarkable. He said, oh my, you poor thing. He asked me, he said, do you accept the cause and effect process of karma? And I said, oh, yes, sir, definitely I do. I have great faith in the three jewels, and I believe implicitly in the cause and effect relationship of karma. And he said, well, then let me put it to you this way. If we didn't have flaws ourselves, how could anybody else harm us? And that put a whole different light on the picture, because he was putting it to me in such a way that I could see not simply that I was being mistreated, but that might in fact be due to the fact that I had negative karma that needed to be purified in that way. I found that advice enormously helpful because it just completely reoriented the way I started thinking about my situation. So it's kind of the difference between, suppose you have a debt, you owe somebody money, and you can't pay it back, so you have to work it off, and you're just really resentful. If I only had the money, I could get rid of this person and get them off my back, that kind of thing. Or you could think of it as, hey, I'm working off the debt. At a certain point, the debt will be repaid. And so when you think of it in the longer term and from the bigger perspective, there's a whole different way of looking at things. And I found that advice that Tulku Orjin Chemchok gave me enormously helpful. Nelson?
that's all tene konga any yang nga so te song da ta chorang gi tene kongro che gu bi jumsen kang res ta kongro che gu bi jumsen rewa ta nga so pe na any tamba ne shek so any lama chena ban song kan lo ge so nga so no payu ni cho so tene ta nga pe du su chen tene pe kongro lang do wa 이 저 공로랑 같은 거 정하다 아니 어다 두수체제 아니 어다 텐데송다 땅알베 아니 다 최고 되는 공로랑 같은 야데서 레스 에레송도 레송 다 빼는 가서 그 점바 그 점송 그 야미데서 에레송도 레시 코조다 가서 찍바 찍장 레송도 코조 다동 가서리 강에 채와레스 나서 파일을 대고 거기 코란소로 파마요래 롱바요래 때 되네 거서 빼대 계산에 애니 라왕메 파 닝체 메라 거서 멘다존 거서 빼대 세토레 랑도지 거서를 닝게 제거래 거서 가서도 찍과래서 어느 땅 가서 빼대 자겐도서 다 pom보도서 인사레테 아니 가서 빼대 계산에 다야 아니 다빼 이니 다 도시체는 트링에 상담다 답에는 막 고소 pom보도서 이니 양아가 빼 도시체 상모지 땅 받는 제 공성도 고초 되는 가르치는 되는 애니 Tata ling about Drupudo, Sichoga, Naga ling about Drupudo Sora, Shurva. Ling about Jebik Driva, Kanyong or some Driva, Yava Doji de la Chegres, and Yetama was a petate by Higgs and General by the pattern. Dorji de la Chegre. Shoot the rich Shigos on Shigos. Ona Chunyava Dorji de la Dronga and Hinge Magic, Chushin Hamlin Dronga and Hinge Jegio Sondo. 저 시당 제사대 쭉 친절 오래했을 거. 인계 제사.
And Tulku Urgyen Chumcho further said to me, he
알았어.
questioned me, he said, so why are you angry? What's the reason for your anger? And I said, well, look at all of the horrible things that have happened. The communists have come in and destroyed the Buddhist teachings. They've killed lamas. They've put lamas like you in prison. He said, oh, so you're angry about the Chinese? And he said, I said, yes, the Chinese communists. And I said, yes. And he said, well, are you angry at all of them, or are you specifically angry at the guards in our prison here? And I said, well, yeah, especially those. Those I really hate. And he said, don't you understand we're the same as them? We're in the same position. Don't you think they have families they'd rather be with, homelands they'd rather be living in, instead of being conscripted to come here and carry guns around and order people around and be mean to everybody all day? Do you think they're having a good time? You need to have compassion for them, because we're all in the same boat. They've got their problems the way we have ours. So rather than thinking that they've got all the control and they're having it great and you're in a terrible position, you should have compassion for them. Particularly since, he said to me, you told me that you accept the cause and effect process of karma. What are these poor folks doing other than accumulating negative karma by destroying the teachings, by killing great teachers and imprisoning them? Don't you think the karmic retribution for that will be rebirth in a realm of hell? If you can't have compassion for somebody who's going to hell, who can you have compassion for? Are you going to have compassion for somebody who's going to heaven? You're completely misplacing where your anger should go. These people are not worthy objects of your anger. They're worthy objects of your compassion. So this is the kind of advice he was giving me. Also.
알았어. 아니? 다 아니 콘남바게 다 주고 어제 잼줬다. 코라스 삼로 동당대다 내 삼로 동당인데 갑철로 와. 콘남비게 괜히 나서 대사 찍을 대요나 콘남비니 애니 드라라양 인게체 나랑 속에 참아 가래 제거 여바 깡을 탐지 다지 냠내게 야 도스처는 냠내는 쳐네 나니 깡가 녀모는 로샤 예때 나니 당보야 레자 야 레게 문트사 다 나랑 노려서래 제니 되게 나랑라 지 삼노테 녀제니 되니 얘니 다 나랑 그 셈노라 아니 때 탐지 야 다지 가서 아니 은익 파 셈바테다 아니 호마기 나랑게 아니 드라르티니 샤당께서 요르도서 갈래 닝게 깨거비가 요르다고 지차 젠데스 제오도 가서 나라라라 징도르 뭐니 터베테 나랑 토비도 나 공조라니 나 괜히 해서나 고절로 너 가야지 투자 말을 나를 동대봐 나 나랑 그 세당데 봐 여기 닝지게 람칼 쓰지 기도 값어 징조르데 나랑 토피야 세모를 이때야 지고요 내가 가래이라다 나랑 저거 지 땅에 가래이네 강가 동네 제도 봐 되네 갈래 나저 뭐만 녀비 나와다데 갈래 나랑 저거 빼 얘네 상황으로 지 차로지도 배는 나저 뭐만 지좀 몰라라 소바다버 얘네 롱젠발라 소바다버 때서 갑지 체메버 저어라데 갑지에 대해서 담지 고지 동아르게 얘네 코라 저거 대 담지 다 샘그 돈이 빼 따당아 저빼 되니 대화당 얘네 따당아랑 저거 가와당 때에 체메베 그 돈이 고좀 매저 지어라 대나기 나랑 저야 샘그 때 주도지 땅도 값어 얘네 지 갈래 대 담지 장 아주 그 랑형수지 주도지 템니 Tene ngoni ki sembate ngarang la chik nga so ini dewa de top. Dosi che chene tene pe ta ngarang so ge ngoma ki ta chik ini jingro de tene ngarang la topa rochi.
Mhm. So when I compared the situation and the attitudes of Tulku Rinchen Chimchok and the other lamas that I studied with in prison versus my own, I could see that while we were all in the same place under the same circumstances, they were able to feel compassion for their enemies, so to speak, and that all of the difficulties and hardships that they underwent they were able to incorporate that into their spiritual practice rather than have it overwhelm them or obstruct them. Whereas when I was honest about myself, all I was doing was becoming more and more caught up in my afflictive emotions by reacting to the same set of circumstances, but in a different way, in a completely different way. So I began to see the error of my ways, and I began to work with my mind. And based upon their kind advice and teachings, I was able to slowly but surely change my attitude so that the people I had felt anger towards and seen as my hated enemies gradually more and more became objects of my compassion, my feelings of compassion. And it became clear to me that I was only hurting myself by indulging in more and more anger and resentment. Because if I got so angry I died of it, they wouldn't care. Made no difference to them, to the guards. All I was doing was hurting myself. So I found in this a source of real inspiration, such that I was much more able over time to accept the hardships and the work that we had to do, the hard labor and so forth, all of those difficulties, and relate to the guards and those who were keeping us prisoner in a much different way, to the point where I can honestly say that what started off being a hell for me ended up feeling like a retreat cabin, where I was in retreat. And it reminded me of the historical examples of the great Milarepa and Longchenpa, who underwent extreme hardships and deprivation, not because of self-punishment or mortification of the flesh or anything like that, but simply because they were able to work with those circumstances in such a way that they were able to experience an effortless state of bliss and peace of mind. So what changed was my mind. So the circumstances were the same, but my attitudes toward those circumstances gradually underwent a transformation. And slowly but surely, I was able to see that if anyone was responsible for my own happiness, it was me. I had to make that decision to take responsibility for my own well-being and my own happiness and work with my mind in order for that to be the case.
Hola sola. Tene ta tene se chene tene rumbari yendo. Tene chik ta nga su lama ni ya. Ini lob yong dang. Ini chik nga su ma changshub ji sen kongwe teso kale kale rak. Teso kale kale tene nyam yung. Je tene kale nga su gupe. Tene se cha yung dugu kapso. Tene senpa te yang. Tene chik ta nga rang su pe ini. Jowa chenpo je temni. Ngoma nga rang ge ta. Nyarwan rawa samge te kali shingham ge nangwan rawa je cha. Ta? Ngone ge ta ngoma nga rang pe. Di ge ta ma tsongkhang no la chukhen ge dra joro. Teso la ya karin rawa chen yung do. Khosu ge nga ma chok pa yina. Nga ten rawa ge nyamhen te rasa ma re. Lama teso ya jensa ma re. Khoso ya karin chenpo rendo samni. Khoso la ya khungtro ge che rawa tegi. Pa tsep rawa jila. Khoso ge ya karin chen yung ge don. Ngarang tini tiso lo kaase deba ina pe tini senpa jiko dan tini chi yunga chigi tini te pe chi tini chi kang chi chong yor kokab chi tini ki toni nge nyamnyong te kare tabare se na nga chi dedok senge ti yor ki tola meba yor ta chikwa chi jang raba ti ki yor chigi nana nge semte tangpo nyarwan ra chi ni kale kale samkhang ra wolon jo kale kale shinkham ra wolon jo ya ti ngarang ki sem ki torin ki don do ya ter te tene nga chu de dog senge te so ya yor ji thola mayin ba chi nga chu sem ji toni joto zo to ku ya ba
Mm-hmm.
tendre ki ta pe na nga chu eni ngone ki ta pe na nga chu lo byung senge te so ke che bo yin ba chi ti ta ngarang rang ki nyamyong ki toni ra chho ba tendre ki yin se
Mm-hmm. Now, this was a gradual process. And of course, during that time, I had access to wonderful lamas and teachers who were able to give me training and teach me how to cultivate bodhicitta. And so slowly but surely, I was able to effect an amazing change in my attitude. So that what had seemed like a hell, although the circumstances externally didn't change, came to seem like I was in a pure land. It felt like a wonderful place to be. And the people whom I had hated as my enemies previously, I began to feel so grateful to them. Because if they had not thrown me into that jail, I would not have met those teachers and I would not have received those teachings. And so I came to feel a real sense of gratitude for my captors. And what had provoked my rage and anger in the past became a source of a sense of real gratitude. And that made my mind so much happier. And so what I learned from my own experience and my practice in that situation is that happiness and suffering have nothing to do with your circumstances. Because my circumstances didn't change, but my attitude did. My experience of those circumstances went from feeling like I was in hell to feeling like I was in a retreat cabin to feeling like I was in a pure realm. It was my own mind that changed, not the circumstances. So I can say definitively, this is my testimony to you from my own experience. I can say definitively, happiness and suffering do not have to do with external circumstances. They have everything to do with your mind, and your mind can change, can be transformed. That's real mental training. That's a really important practice for us to undertake, is purifying and training our minds in this way.
라소라 tene songzang tene tata nga to dodo tembi nima ge tila ane donga lam de chesa do kunjo to tadam sonya ge nani tene tangbo tele tene ji song yi do
Mm.
semkyen da semkyen maye be tsewa nam jong do donga jin de shi ba she la jo ba la lo kom na yor chen chamo ri chen song chenbo je de do gun de shi kan komba tem pen ro wa chuni yimbi Tela ramji kombi topate chishena kanang pachiri yik mdeban rembi. Jor songe dewe kokab peche cha meba. Kokab ye meba she yongs.
Mm.
Te rang lo komsor je lemba. Mishepi psurur yorje kien kone nyebar zongi. Char kongchu lengen je meche tome do chebar jobe. Nawa dra langpa she chao so da te. Ta
Mm.
ngarang ini nyamnyong thone. Tikarang denpa denchang rese. Ta te ngarang raptro chegiyos.
So at this point, it seems pertinent to go back to the text by Dodo Jigme Tembe Nima, where he's talking about using suffering and happiness as the path. And you remember he was saying that there are these two parts, how to use suffering, and that's what he's first going to deal with, and then how to use your happiness on the path. So let's start with that. On the completely, and he says you can approach this on the relative level and on the level of absolute truth, of the more ultimate level. So first he's talking about how to use suffering as a path to enlightenment. And in his text he says, whenever we are harmed by sentient beings or anything else, if we make a habit out of perceiving only the suffering, then when even the smallest problem comes up, it will cause enormous anguish in our minds. This is because the nature of any perception or idea, be it happiness or sorrow, is to grow stronger and stronger the more we become accustomed to it, the more we focus on it. So as the strength of this pattern gradually builds up, before long we'll find that just about everything we perceive becomes a cause for actually attracting unhappiness towards us, and happiness will never get a chance. If we do not realize that it all depends on the way in which mind develops this habit, and instead we put the blame on external objects and situations alone, The flames of suffering, negative karma, aggression, and so on will spread like wildfire without end. And this is what is called all appearances arising as your enemies. I can guarantee, Rinpoche said, that this is true. From my own experience, I can put my seal of approval on this and say, yes, that is actually the case.
다 ngaranzu yang tela me karsene nimi semje dongar jezebi jumsen sosor topi top membandela togya ba hebdu hegusem 다 ngaranzoge eni metesola tene chik dongar chamo chik yaba yenayang penata ngaso tele doga penata ngaso semge chik hingtop segenandra sosola chik doga penata kashila chungchoje yonayo dati halebe chenboje tsini 다 ngali duwa che zambul nengla me samba chiche teni da pede chese tenre chiche ni teni pede chese tegi donghara ten da nga zu mechik bate sem nala te nagin ka pakcha te kale kale san chedo rode teni da seye nawa tamche yang te nagin ka pede chese re ene ta tsama che drar jorni penata me kashi tere doa ari de solkono penata korange semgi namdo robo chik pen mite takwa nga te hodo sengero takko takwa tungna
La,
ko ngala ta pen michik tene ko ta ko sem magawa chago esara ba
ore,
ini ta ko kadu ya ko tugo doasem tene ku takwa ngala tene peta te yongo sa karesena tena sengedene mangodo karesena ene te trabo ke tene chik megi tata semnola tokwaji yoda meti ko megi chik tena ngarangla ene tata te chi kemsaji kenso samgedo chi thona ya kemsanrabo tene te ta kandra nawata tene cheni shok chedo kwanzen chedo pede namto chedo rohdo tene songzang tene koso mata nga zu pena ene te na yinga ta pena ene rang chik ene te tamjela chik dog to so lamche di che matom na nawa de drar te ba yina tene tege tene semje chowa te yang chedo roya tene tama me ban roya chi pena tene dongar rawo che na chung che yang zo mato pa tene dongar chemo yang chik nga so ene tene se cha ro do ene me kashi tere chik pena thong do pena tata ngarang zu ene ta ngarang la tene pena tene tene mangbo yo ta ngarang to america la pena ta nga to pe chu cancer ki na do singen rawo chi net araba ta te la ene semba lamsam madeni tene cholo chung ranghi jamne tene mangbo do 다 pena tene 다 초진이 삼로 다 대양아 저 pena 다 가르디 pena 랑히 고미도 내기 가리 도는 거나 히 도그러 왔더니 랑히 고미도 다 삼. 다 타마데 히 도그러 왔더니 데리 랑 대소 다 삼로 땅 맞아 pena 대비장 거저 내들라 당고 뛰어야게 탑지 걸어 봐 뛰어야게 탑지 대 매나야 tene ta ngaran zo go tela pe enin nga che ta ngaran chipo la mare te trabo pe na mi tong ra ma mo chitra ma mo nga to tsama ta ma te ya kashi la te trabo yena ya sem la chi ka nga kaya maybe o ta te se chene ta chi le chene de to pa le ka me de che donga me ba kashi yena tene lamsang ngaran zo ma ta chi nga zo te drabo ke ta chi rangme chen ro ya tene ke pen nga su sem ge ta cherdang ge thoni pen min ra ba mang bo yong de ge was
our author goes on to say, we should arrive at a very precise understanding that the whole reason why sentient beings in this degenerate age are plagued by so much suffering is because they have such feeble powers of discernment. Now, what he means by this is the fact that if our minds become so hypersensitive to perceiving problems, to perceiving things as painful or difficult, even the slightest thing can be blown out of all proportion. And so somebody can get to the point where they're experiencing what is objectively a fairly minor problem, but they feel like there's nobody worse off than them on earth. They're just in the worst possible position. Nobody's got it like me. And that habit pattern can get reinforced more and more and more until, as the saying goes in Tibetan, all appearances arise as your enemy. So you're at war with the world. Everything seems to be against you, everyone and everything. And you might focus on and obsess about an individual person and be completely paranoid and feel like they're out to get you. And so you just continually, a person in this situation just continually becomes more and more angry, more and more upset, more and more suspicious, more and more sure that the world is out to get them. And they hold that grudge, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And there's really no end to that. The more we perpetuate that pattern, the worse off it gets. So we become so hypersensitive, we can't deal with the slightest upset or the slightest issue that comes up. So it really is a question of not so much the circumstances, but whether we're able to take them in stride and work with them rather than having them overwhelm us. So suppose we take the situation of a person who gets a diagnosis of cancer. For some people, they feel like that's an immediate death sentence and they want to go and kill themselves. They just give up all hope right away. The problem with that is whether the disease was going to kill them or not, they're going to kill themselves by the way they're reacting to the news. But if they can understand that just like thousands of other people who have this problem, there are steps they can take. It may be perfectly possible to cure their disease. It may be perfectly possible to go on living a productive life. But to immediately take something like that diagnosis or any kind of circumstance, that's just an example, some kind of circumstance as an immediate death sentence, so to speak, and to give up hope is what we're talking about here. And people have different ways of reacting. Other people might get the same news and say, I can work with that. I'm okay. Let's see what we can do, because they know they're better at working with the circumstances of suffering than others. So it's really a question of the individual's way of reacting or interpreting the circumstances. And people are of very different stripes in terms of how they react to the same news, the same circumstances. Awesome.
알았어. 다양 아주 되나 다치 아주 이니 람체르스는 Tene yang tene chi song do wa pe na eni kare se da donga la su ban pe na dra ta ne de don la su pe pa che ji me chok shi bi tan de
Mm.
ne la su ba te da yung wa le do ba ta se ta ne de so yung go ma re so chi mung jong wa la mu ja yi se
Mm.
te da dru pi pa che de che mu ni ba la cha o sa
So continuing on, our author says, so not to be hurt by the obstacles created by enemies, illness, or harmful influences does not mean to say that things like sickness can be driven away and that they will never occur again. Rather, it simply means that they will not be able to obstruct us from practicing on our path.
la su tene chi song zang eni 강한다리 다 애니 동her 때서 담게야 되네 땅아서 동her다 강her다 가래 줘나야 돼서 참참나 돼서 담게야 바르체 돼서 담게 닝도블 존롱했던데 요레스
And what we can find is that all kinds of problems and pain and suffering and difficulties, rather than being obstacles, can actually be something that spurs us on to develop more courage, more strength of mind, because we can meet the challenge. So they present us with a challenge which we can learn how to meet effectively rather than just being overwhelmed by it. Russell?
벤나 되네 롱체람 정 되네 송도와 애니 네다 돈을 속바 벤나 땅아서 애니 던지 녜니 추다 tre바티 덴데니 비너브제 가링체스
It was Longchenpa who remarked that with respect to illnesses and demonic or negative influences and forces in our lives and so forth, he said, the fact that this impels us toward our practice of the Dharma makes these beings and these situations extraordinarily kind to us.
삼삼라 되니 쟁에 돼서 cross 줘야 pena tata nga so donghar teso teni nga so karsa chik dewa de jurya tendege teni yang ngaran so ta ani nga so pena ta shibje dang teni tela so pena teni ta nga so teso no la chik ani nyamne chi nga so mangbo che te che yore ta teso tre che magwa che.
And without going into it in a great deal of detail at this point, suffice it to say that counterproductive circumstances and so forth can actually be our allies. So that what would, under other circumstances, brought us suffering can, under the circumstances, bring us happiness. So there's all different kinds of mental exercises of way of thinking and contemplating and practices and so forth, all of which is far beyond the scope of this short teaching to go into. But suffice to say that something that you would ordinarily take to be a negative situation, a negative circumstance, can become your ally, your support. Uh-huh.
Yang tembi nima gen rang do nga bala ta che de mendo be lo ga kwa to dongar te chungwa la ga bi lo che pa ni drop go be esa tangbo donga la ta che de mendo be na bala ti ni yi mga be zere kisam che chang go ne me chen ni me che be chola ni ba yang ni yang do chang la chin che donga che tra chong yang zere me ge nyam do pemba trapo Pemba trouble mando chasing, ning top cherchebal logos.
So going back to our text, the author says, in order for this to happen, that these circumstances not obstruct us on our path, we need first to get rid of the attitude of being entirely unwilling to face any suffering ourselves, and secondly, to cultivate the attitude of actually being joyful when suffering arises. So first there's this idea of dropping the attitude that we are completely unwilling to suffer. And he says, think about all the depression and anxiety and irritation we put ourselves through by always seeing suffering as unfavorable and something to be avoided at all costs. Now think about two things: how useless this is and how much trouble it causes. Go on reflecting on this repeatedly until you are absolutely convinced. And then say to yourself, from now on, whenever I have to suffer, I will never become anxious or irritated. Go over this again and again in your mind and summon all of your courage and determination. Uh-huh.
Lazola ta carese. Any young tinning also dongar te choose yona magaba jam gushin. Choose matobna magabe shipi chang pemba melas. Tati shiva lag tini song yorwa. Kati choose yona tel magaji. Kati choose mal tel magaba china kari pengres.
And the author states, first, let's look at how useless it is to regard suffering as something to be avoided at all costs. He says, if we can do something to solve a problem, then there's no need to worry or be unhappy about it. Just do it. If we can't, then it doesn't help to worry or be unhappy about it either. And this calls to mind a famous quote from the Indian Buddhist master Shantideva in his Bodhicharyavatara, the Entering on the Way of the Bodhisattva, where he says, if you can do something about it, what's the point of worrying? If you can't do something about it, what's the point of worrying?
Any dongan chonsare, kalina chonsare. Any ta telas, any zeres and zere mound chena, any take it tadonya, legit tobnyam, semjit tobnyam, dongar ya, dongar get tola, dongar chedroya mado, any pantomidoas.
So then the second question is the enormous trouble that is involved in us treating suffering as something to be avoided at all costs. To the extent that we become anxious and upset and resentful when suffering occurs, to that extent, all we're doing is sapping our own physical and mental strength. And we're making the situation infinitely worse. What is the point? There really is no point to that at all. It doesn't help. Awesome.
Zere majena, pando karayoresena, dongar chemboyan. River terrors yang sapar chorni, korlawayin. zere jibe wanga dongar chunguya medebe choba mezeba neni shinda zokaba te yongwa yinsa.
And Dodo Teminima goes on to say, then as long as we don't get anxious and irritated, then our strength of mind will grow and it will enable us to bear even the hardest sufferings easily. They'll start to feel to us as though they're as flimsy and insubstantial as cotton wool. But while we're dominated by anxiety, even the tiniest problem becomes extremely difficult to cope with because we have the additional burden of mental discomfort and unhappiness.
Tene ngaran zo payu teso la ta nga zo mi teso tene se ta tene mangbo yongore ngoma yina ta tene shion tene te drawo ta chik tene chine rodo pa tene ta teso tap tene kangwa cha tsuma chak tene se mangbo yongore
Uh,
tene ta pama dang tene teso go tene chik ko karen la go sna tene ta pe de che tene kangwa cha ta che pe ne kangwa ngo cha mi do pe 被压过的那个我掐米都是的，刚把掐到了，等你读过生的变成谁呀呢？大个动啊的嘛，我就被那个刚把掐的，这个怎么掐的？我掐米都被压过生的，可能我把反正我掐米都是的，干嘛要见的？这里有的是。
I remember in my home region, people rode a lot of horses, and so there were a lot of accidents where people fell and broke their legs and arms and things like that. And I can remember my folks saying, somebody would break their leg and they'd be going on, oh, I broke my leg. And they'd say to them, you're so lucky you didn't break your skull. And it was a way of trying to put it in a whole different perspective. Instead of just whinging on about the fact that you had this broken leg and paying all the attention, consider yourself fortunate. You could have fallen off the horse and smashed your skull. So they would say, hey, you're lucky you didn't smash your skull. All you did was break a leg. Lucky guy.
都是，对，啊，但谁来监督这个对了吧？但你刚把的查出来了吧？刚查出来了，但俺哩读个没上了，等你个被什么读嘛错了的被这个，你他那个 top 娘什个 top 娘看看嘛查呢？样搞下去公平，他这样去过对的多，别那搞下去公平他我查没到最多三百张。 참선을 드리려면 오래 가서 다 드라인 거 파르치에 다 되게 셋살에 다 이나 빼 야고래 다 되게 파르치에 셋살에 생긴다고 된대게 양고 샘그 삼로지 땅해지 대대소 그다 빼는 게서 애니 삼그 삼로 동난 적인 좀 할래바지 때문에 땅 두고 놓았어.
Mm-hmm. So if we take the example of someone who's broken their leg and they've convinced themselves that no one's worse off than them, no one's in more pain, no one's in a worse situation, all they're doing is wearing themselves down physically and mentally. They're exhausting themselves by focusing on that. It might be possible then to say to them or for them to consider, hey, at least I didn't smash my skull. I'm okay. To see it in a different perspective. And in fact, where I come from, we have a tendency to view these kinds of things as obstacles that have now been finished. Aren't I lucky? I broke my leg today and that's over. That particular karmic obstacle's done with. So the point is that when we use our minds in this way, we find that our minds have enormous power to effect change, transformation in how we perceive things. Awesome.
다 때는 양 빼기 자도 빼는 짐이 차도로 또 있는 차 가로 시정 나라 잠도 세바다 동아지 동안은 이 시체를 때나 조선 제 민에비 왕보 담비 맹아 남네 중화다 동할 때라 이 시제 세면 문제 봐. 로 나도 야라 랑소 좀아 헬라 공고소사.
And our author, Dodo Teminima, gives us a kind of slightly amusing example where he says, imagine, for example, trying to get rid of desire and attachment for someone we find attractive while continuing to dwell on all the while on their attractive qualities. It would all be in vain. This is not going to work. But in just the same way, if we concentrate only on the pain brought by suffering, we'll never be able to develop endurance or the ability to bear it. So as in the instructions that are technically called sealing the doors of the senses, don't latch on to all kinds of mind-made concepts about your suffering. Learn instead to leave your mind undisturbed in its own natural state, to bring the mind home, rest there, and let it find its own ground. Awesome.
라수다 강한다리양 동하르테 아니 동하르도 존나 아니 코도 동하레레와 양 동하르테 양 아주 가르세고로고 애니 어다 연델 존이 레와 페나 가라 테니 참sam나 딱 가서 페나 삼노동나 게 페나 가서 그 동하르테양 아주 초진이 연대를 여러봐. 배차게라다 나랑 저거 아니 특바 첨보도 상로 동당이나 딱 가서라 동아리 여발을 때니 되는 가서라 팬도 먹고 용어로 동아리 여발을 때니 nemjong chege yore nemjong chege yobala teni ane ta nga tsugo pena eni ta soso tarbeke dombala soba tabje yore yeje donghal yobala teni tela jamchob je semde so tabje jeje yore pena ta nga tso pena ta nga tso lala soba teso donga me bala teni 대 탐지기 돈바섭니 너도 용음이다. 참자는 나서 동아리 여바티 나서 그 캡상을 해야 돼. 나서 동아리 여바를 때니 나서 람드로바게 때니 여네 여래. 대 나인 게더니 나서 녀무 여바를 때니 얘네 나서 이니 도르제틱 벨 람쳇서 제트고 여래. 때때 나서 그때니 매일 여내라야 참sam라 나서 동아리 여바 녀몽이여 받아서 야 삼선을 패토고 여러분 가서 그래서 그때 얘는 박비게 여대야 돼요.
So if we insist on seeing suffering only as suffering, it's suffering. But if we could see it as to our advantage somehow, in a certain sense, and this draws in the kind of Mahayana mentality, if you will, the fact that we have suffering has enormous benefits because it encourages in us a will to become free of samsara and to go about working out our own individual liberation through making a commitment on that level. And the fact that there are others who suffer means that we have the opportunity to arouse and develop our bodhicitta, our altruistic and compassionate concern and resolve to benefit others and bring them to enlightenment as well. So if we had been reborn in one of the gods' realms where there's virtually no suffering, such a thought would never occur to us. We'd just pass the time having a wonderful time and never think about working towards liberation or benefiting others. So the fact that we suffer is to our advantage because it encourages us to pursue a path of spiritual development. In a similar way, the fact that we have negative afflictive emotions means that we can practice the Vajrayana. That's what it's for, is to transform those negative mental states. So in one sense, you can say these are problems and negative things, but in another sense, from another perspective, these are advantages and serve a real purpose.
근데지 송장 되는 양 이바 때라 가르 송도스나 동할 람로스 뛰는 가바 곰바 때스 대야 동할 강요 랑 로 네바다 때는 gebjo레라 세주 메나 께르 탕퀴다 되나 동할라 때니 페연 대당 대다바 톱데 여도 히바 짬기 만드 쌈장 남과다 사이베 발 렌신 시바 따르 손이 고바 롭가오 디나 레히 동할라 때니 임종거 삼바 용원네스 아니 제시 왕메도 코발라 참바 테스도 동할음 용원네 너의 바시 중앙 마인자 코빙은 또 때다와 인냐바당세 레시 덴도 나양 뼈비 동할 녀체바야 Datar zobar kana ngesong ko dongan ngeke gue.
Mhm.
Che gue des. Yemon korbe tingta mebe dongan je jamso yeno nyamdo jowa jete. Yik tarbala chobar jao san.
So what I've been speaking about segues right into this next discussion by our author, where he's talking about cultivating an attitude of being joyful when suffering arises. So seeing suffering as an ally to help us on the path, we must learn to develop a sense of joy when it arises. Yet whenever suffering strikes, unless we have some kind of spiritual practice to bring to it, one which matches the capacity of our mind, no matter how many times we might say to ourselves, well, as long as I've got roughly the right method, I'll be able to use suffering and obtain such and such a benefit. If we just kind of give lip service to it, it's highly unlikely we'll succeed. We'll be as far from our goal, as the saying goes, as the earth is from the sky. Therefore, we use suffering as the basis for the following practices. And the first of these that was referred to is using suffering to train in renunciation, in the sense of a will to become free from the sufferings of samsara. Renunciation in that sense. So sometimes then, our author states, use your suffering in order to train your mind in this renunciation, in this will to become free. Say to yourself, as long as I wander, powerless and without any freedom in samsara, this kind of suffering is not something unjust or unwarranted. It's simply the very nature of samsara. And at times develop a deep sense of revulsion in yourself by thinking, if it's already so hard for me to bear even the little suffering and pain of the happy realms, then what about the suffering of the lower realms? Samsara is indeed an ocean of suffering, fathomless and without end. And then you turn your mind, this turns your mind toward liberation and enlightenment. It impels you in that direction. So,
Wala so tene song zang. Eni nga tse sanji getini. Chue song de yang tangbo. Nga tso tene dongar shebar cha song ya te kai chenpo song. Chue tangbo song ya te dongar shebar cha se. Kunjong pangwara cha se. Ta dongar ma she na. Tene dongar ke jyote she tukumi no.
mm,
동아리 그 교대 동아리 시내 때네 가서 동아리 그 교대를 삼어 동아리 그 교대를 삼어 땅에 때네 가서 빵하는데 시 용거라 봐
mm-hmm.
근데 소장 가서 때네 낭베 참살랑 가서 뭐로 또서라 당보 가서 야 동아리 삼어 미세게 동아리야 삼기네 내가 ini nge song dang tini dogi dongala samo tangani ko konzo yale tini zoni yang che che gorwa tini nga so donga nguso yodi tikara pa pejo tangnan pige doa sai
When the Buddha first taught the Dharma, when he taught the Four Noble Truths, the basic principle he expounded was suffering is to be understood and the universal cause of suffering is to be eliminated. So he said, first we have to recognize suffering for what it is. And then we begin to inquire, well, what's the cause of that? Why is there this suffering that is the case? And then we come to a point where we start to make moral choices in our lives of what we choose to do and not to do because we understand what the underlying causes of suffering are. And this is why it is the case that in a lot of the preliminary stages of Buddhist practice, there's what seems to many people to be a kind of morbid obsession with suffering. The people are encouraged to think about suffering a lot. But it's not a question of just suffering to feel upset. It's a question of recognizing suffering in order to make use of it. It's happening anyway. The important point from the Buddhist perspective is to recognize it as such and then start working with it, start using it.
yete tini ngaran zo ge pena dongar yobala teni dongar sambala teni tini ngaran zo ge khowala nimjong senge te a tege che ge yore
Hmm.
ani tela teni teni semjenge dongar yobala teni ninge senge te a tela teni che ge doa
Mm.
nga chola tini dongar samya mena tini ninge che sa yo marwa
Hmm. So the fact that we experience suffering and that we recognize it and pay attention to it is what encourages us as individuals to experience this sense of this will to become released from that, to gain release from the cycle of samsara that is by its very nature one of suffering. The fact that other people suffer as well and that we are able to think about that gives us a context for arousing compassion. If nobody suffered, there would be no context in which to develop compassion at all. It's only because there is suffering that we can develop the will to be free of it and the compassion for others who undergo it.
nga so la tene ta nga so nangba sang da nga so nangba sangji pa ji yin zong de tene nga so ge nangba ge te la ta nga so tar to gu ribbon da de tene sangji ra ba
But
ta sangji ge jo de kan re se na chang chob ji sem re se go re chang chob ji sem ji jo de kan re se na tene ning ge la tene nga so pe na shamba da ning ge la to yong da ning ge la
So to put this into perspective, with respect to compassion, in the Buddhist context, we describe Buddhahood as the pinnacle goal, if you will, the ultimate goal, the attainment of Buddhahood. But what is the cause of that attainment of Buddhahood? It is bodhicitta. It is that awakening, enlightening attitude. And what is the cause of that? Loving kindness and compassion. So the fact that there is suffering experienced by others gives us a context for compassion, which is the cause of bodhicitta, which is the cause of the attainment of Buddhahood. Chamdra.
Tenim. Jamru Jangwa Nese, Jamru Jangwa ne Tese, Serap Juman, Jigban Deta, Yanda, Nyamba Mulapi, Jabs Choba, the Conjos on Kona Yimbi, Chicha te Kona in the Temper Jacking. There's some Jelapap, Tamar Maja, Nyamdo, Neighbor Shini, Jamru Gomba.
The next point that our author makes in using suffering in a positive way is by using suffering to train in taking refuge. So he says, say to yourself, life after life, again and again, we are continuously plagued by these kinds of fears, and the one and only protection that can never fail us is the precious guide, the Buddha, the precious path, the Dharma, and the precious companions on the way, the Sangha, the three jewels. So it is on them that I must rely entirely. Whatever happens, I will never renounce them. Let this become a firm conviction and train in the practice of taking refuge.
That's all. Tayang ato tene Jabson Rovala, Jamro, Jusang a Joro. Jabson Rogan Jota Carasana, Jigba, Tepa, Ninja Sagora. Nato Jabson Rogu Jimson and Natola, Jigpachi, Yoni, then it Jabson Tango, Nato and Jiba made Jabson Rogo them. Pena Naranso get any Natsak and Eggy Jigba Yona, Nato Membala, then a Jabson Rogo. Te nanjinge ngaso le jikwa mele chapse lo godan yoma. Tene terte ngaso le jikwa te yoni ta eni donghar geta ngaso donghar songe jikwa te yoni chapse lo goy. Chapse rosa te yang chapse robe yorte tene ta ngaran zo pena eni hora eni chartni ngaso karsa eni jikpa tamche jar yen tamche jikpa le chopi ki nipa yonghenchi teni gogu yore mado teni raya koso pe eni karase goro kuta pe eni chuyi cher dengen che la ta ngaran zogu chuyi kor rongi yenda ka ngale kyab rochi se na kyab tukumido teni song ta teni ta konjo sombo teso tamche rang kowa le drolu yenda la teni drolwik Eni kowali drobi niba yoba. Tende sondan ta tela nga so karasana pena te tabugi ani jumsen hipi ki teba chi tongba tela tene teba sagan. Rāda tabu senke mambu te tabugi tene che ngārang chikwa mayin bagan tene dongar tseme pa yobala tene tela nyingye sa. Ta tsogo tene kyabsan rose na tsogo ta di jusomde tsango kodwa jikwa ta. 대바다 닝게송 jigbe nyesong kyamru josem.
Now, taking refuge really involves three factors, if you will. A kind of healthy fear, faith or trust, and thirdly, compassion. What is meant by a healthy fear is recognizing the fact that you have a disease. Your concern is such that you seek a doctor. If you didn't know you had the disease, you wouldn't seek help in the first place. Well, once you've recognized you have a disease, then you're concerned. You're afraid, but in a healthy way, because you want to get better. So you seek a healer, a doctor, somebody who can help you. So once we've recognized that we are subject to the three kinds of suffering in samsara and are deeply concerned about that, that kind of healthy fear drives us to seek some source of refuge. And anything that can constitute an object of refuge must be that which is free of that kind of fear itself, and yet embodies the ability to protect others from such fear. Because otherwise, if we take refuge in something less than that, we're like somebody being swept along in a flood, and the person next to us is being swept along in the flood, and we say, help me. And that's not going to happen because you're both carried away by the water. So it has to be somebody who has freed themselves, gotten to dry land, and is able to pull you out, so to speak, just to use the metaphor. So it has to be something, the object of refuge has to be that which embodies the freedom from that fear in the first place and the capacity and ability to free others in the second. So once you have recognized that and have understood the reasons why the three jewels constitute an authentic source of refuge, then you begin to experience that second quality for taking refuge, that of faith and trust. And thirdly, when you further take refuge with the understanding that just like you, countless other beings are subject to the fear of undergoing that suffering in samsara, you experience a compassion for them that is part and parcel of your taking of refuge. So taking refuge really has these three factors of this healthy fear or concern, faith and trust, and compassion.
나서 다 직바사반의 공들 시에바 따라 라라 왕메게 따도 동하리 영원견리 만디 비 촐라텐도 레초 좀비 드라고 나저다 예 체드 소비 롱네 철제바오 소리다 베나다다 나초 에니 나저 생인데 다 나초 그베지 에니 렉소티아 그냥 드라드라고 빼나 나저 때네 짜기 파운라 되니 다 여대게 춤을 췄어 얘는 짜기 도도 때네 춰대게 말어 어다 때라고 그래서
The next point that our author makes is that you can use suffering to overcome arrogance. And he says, as I explained before, as long as we are in samsara, we are never independent or truly free or in control of our lives. On the contrary, we are always dependent on and at the mercy of suffering. So we must eliminate what is called the enemy that destroys anything that is wholesome and good, which is arrogance and pride. And we must do away with the evil attitude of belittling others and considering them as inferior. And this brings to mind a saying in the teachings that one of our worst enemies is our own pride and arrogance, our own sense of self-importance. It's said that our pride is like an iron ball, and any positive qualities are like water trying to penetrate into the center of that iron ball. It just runs off, it won't. When you have that hard iron ball of pride, anything of a positive nature that could affect the situation just can't penetrate.
다 딕바 종원은 동은 됐다본 리비 치체와 빠도메 바시네 딕바 바시엘레 종오시 링에 바다 페르치아바다 마지에 바다 멘체 바다 제바 추미자바 예고네 렉버 삼라 대여차 동을 문도나 대 좀 먹게와 빵거 냠니 또비에 샤신 치마 돈발라 베버 자오 소마 다티 애니 땅아란 저거 빼나다 동을게 싸와데 동을데 다 가르세 강나 토도르세는 땅아서 이니 다 나치더니 쟁아서다 레라 토도 여러봐서 레게 빼나더니 가서 동을 문도나 되니 아니 마음바 되니 다 먹여봤다서 빵고 그래 애니 대탐지 땅아서 가르세는 애니 배나인게 땅아서 빼나다 애니 동할당 애니 동할 그 쥐어대서 동ар 매바 조고나 페나타 동ar 그 주테서 애니 장야도 개치 못이라 차도요라
Hmm.
페나 땅가란 조고 나차라고 지기나 근데 땅가 조고 페나 지 당본이니 땅가 조지 캔슬라고 지기요나 다티게 캔슬 그 주테 가르도 당본이 가서 이 내도 마호박 개치 못 차도요래 가데 포철 소나 다 데이터함께 되니 땅가란 조고 페나 마 애니 샥교체 고는 샥교체 메사 고는 메사 다 ngaran zo ko te na gen che ne tene mong tu ne ta te ta ba ko tene dongal ta so me be ki tab ta ten go go yor ba o ta te ra yin ba de.
Fourthly, our author encourages us to use suffering to purify ourselves of the effects of harmful actions. And he says, remind yourself and realize all this suffering which I'm going through, and suffering which is greater still, all the boundless suffering that there is in samsara, comes from nothing but harmful negative actions. So reflect carefully and thoroughly how, in the first place, karma is certain. Cause and effect is infallible. Secondly, karma multiplies enormously. Thirdly, you will never face the effects of something you have not done. And fourthly, whatever you have done will never go to waste. It will never be something you can avoid. Then say to yourself, so if I really don't want to suffer anymore, then I must give up the cause of suffering, which is this negativity. With the help of the four powers in practice, you make an effort to acknowledge and purify yourself of all the negative actions you have accumulated in the past, and then firmly resolve to avoid doing them in the future. So this brings up the point that when we talk about what we experience as suffering, what that boils down to is negative karma as the source or root that accounts for that negative experience. And if we don't want to suffer, we should start at this point to say, well, at least I don't want to suffer in the future, so I'm going to avoid creating the causes for future suffering. So I need to avoid negative, harmful kinds of behavior that create the negative karma that leads to suffering in the first place. But if we really also want to get rid of not only the suffering, but the causes of suffering, we need to take remedial steps. So again, if I go back to this example of cancer, the disease of cancer, we're getting more and more clear on what the causes of cancer are. So the smart thing to do would be never to indulge in any kind of activity that could cause cancer in the first place. But then if once you have that diagnosis, then you need to rely on whatever means are at your disposal, be it surgery, chemo, radiation, alternative, whatever, to cure yourself of that disease. But it's a question of really addressing the problem rather than just letting it happen. Awesome.
다 양 개발을 가바니 동할 로비 대발을 가는 뒤저 개발은 베그 냠도 제벌 삼베 고니 게비 초 케퍼도 자오세 다 강한테 다 개발 생인데 얘네 랑게 답에는 령아 이솜지 고니 드니 지 개발 아니 빼는 연제 랑라 아니 어 다다 가서 펜비글리 텔타 게와세 거마
Hmm.
페나 타 게와체 티 랑라야 펜바게 자와치 드로비 예나 미옌다 그 페나타 랑라 가와 나기 랑게 짱 예라 펜비게 자와테 드롬나 텔 게와세게요
Hmm.
에테 예니 테타부 그 랑게 티 랑게 짱 예라 게바게 초 아니 강 롭톱 제고 냠비게 야 애니 게와 페야 ene te na ge nyinge la la ba senge te da yin de yen la ya dongar te ta ba ta te le chi che bi na so la sam te da ge dongar tam je ta na che ma ro nyam do se te ne ra la dongar yo na ma ga ba yin za te ne yen la ya dongar ge cho bi jo te rang ge chi te ne chi che ba yin na te ma we ba 아니 대 나경게 되네 동할 탐지다 자나 찌 마로 삼비게 샘 양양치는 대비장 홍바 메니 잠바 검sol라서 시버자오사
Fifthly, he advises us to use suffering to find joy in positive action. So you say to yourself, if I really want to find happiness, which is the opposite of suffering, then I have got to make an effort to practice its cause, which is positive action. Think about this in detail and from every angle, and dwell on the implications. Then in every way possible, do whatever you can to make your positive beneficial actions increase. So when we use a term in this context like virtuous or positive action, we're talking about physical actions, verbal actions, mental actions, the way we use our minds, in ways that bring benefit to ourselves and others. So a very simple definition of that which is virtuous and positive is that which benefits. So just as when someone acts well towards us and creates benefit for us, we feel better. In the same way, when we benefit others, they feel better. All of that is part of a process that we can call the path of virtue, the path of positive action. So he's suggesting that we use suffering as a way to find joy, to inspire us to act in more positive ways. And then he talks about using suffering to train in compassion. And he says, say to yourself, just like me, others too are tormented by similar suffering or even much worse. Train yourself by thinking, if only they could be free from all this suffering, how wonderful it would be. This will also help you to understand how to practice loving kindness, where the focus of the practice is on those who have no happiness.
라소라 다 다비 옌지 곰바는 다긴데 동허 좀 마동와나 토마 메바니 랑 찌버 좀 렘베 다네 델레긴 주니 예 찌번 좀바 코나 네버 자오 냠드 곰바오스.
In light of this, our author suggests also using suffering as a way to learn how to cherish others more than yourself. So he says, train yourself to think, the very reason why I am not free from suffering such as this is that from time immemorial, I have only cared about myself. Now, from this moment onwards, I will only cherish others because this is the source of all happiness and good.
That there's some of this tango do becha yana. Any tangaranzo ngaranzo sepje tamje da jinzin chipo la samno tangje den tata ka part tene ni ta khorwala donga cheme ba nyang de gre zobi sanje deso zobi sanje ge ene yen devala tene koso pene ene do devala gumche ne tene sanje sore der tene ta koso pene ngatsu ene dabde khona lambashile chenitini ngasolo jongrakbata zobi sanjege yembeje semje kesan chenboje radwa tete tene kejonyi samlo tangni ya tene digitose.
So this is something that needs to be thought about, needs to be contemplated. What is being stated here is that the reason we have suffered endlessly in lifetime after lifetime in samsara up to the present is primarily due to our obsession with our own self-interest, that we think primarily of ourselves. On the other hand, the completely enlightened Buddhas did and could only attain Buddhahood through an overwhelming concern with the welfare of others. So it's a question of, if you want to think of it as like a balance sheet, like a profit and loss balance sheet, here we have us ordinary folks who tend to think only of ourselves and suffer as a result, and Buddhas who tend to think only of others and gain Buddhahood. So if you really want to profit from your undertaking, there's where the real profit lies, if you want to put it in those terms. You're not really going to get anywhere by serving your own selfish interests, because that's really not going to bring about anything of any consequence. But concern for the welfare of others can lead to, and has led to, for many, Buddhahood. Awesome.
Pena ta ngaranzo ge yembe changkyup ji sem yora tene penam changkyup ji sem tene che keche gomba yena ya karba ge dikpa ngaso tene thad hodwa pena tene changkyup sem ji chonam ene ta che ngaso pena ta ngaso ini changkyup ji sem ji pela tene do pena karpa tondile pe mina tamche rome che ge tene keche lan jomba na yin pena ta changkyup ji sem ene kechi du cheba chegi tene karpige dikpatam che tene jangro yoba oda teta ba tene ke nga so ene peyona samna teta ba chang yores.
Concerning this altruistic motivation of bodhicitta, the benefits and advantages of it of developing this quality of mind are enormous. In fact, it is said in the teachings that to experience bodhicitta, real bodhicitta for even a single instant, purifies your mind stream of eons of effects from negative actions. And the metaphor that's used is, suppose you had a dark cave that had been dark for millennia, and you light a single candle in the middle of it, the darkness is immediately gone. All that darkness that has been the case for millions of years, perhaps, is instantly gone. That's the kind of power that bodhicitta has. And so the benefits and advantages of cultivating that quality of mind that we term bodhicitta are unfathomable.
대양 동 툭디 힌도 까비 쟁에다 세주 gebyor teda ngani driba karchesha rangla kang gomba sarva hi zobar zonde sena che
And on this note of cherishing yourself, others more than yourself, or Arthur states, it's extremely difficult to use suffering as the path when it has already struck and is staring us in the face. That is why it is crucial to become familiar in advance with the specific practices to be used when misfortune and difficulties do befall us. It's also particularly helpful and will really count if we use the practice we know best and of which we have a clear personal experience. Russell?
da 대양 da chi nga zo any 쟁에 desola chi da ani de cheala chi any lamdo cheala ya da tambo rangla chi kare chi tini shok cheba yo bandrawo de tene bandrawo chi la ma zongje ani tene ngarang zo karsa any ma any nyamlen to so chi de cheba ina tene chi nga zo any kechembo yo resole.
Mm-hmm. This relates to the principle of carrying negative circumstances on the path, so to speak, in that when we deal with what our biggest problem is and bring all of our practice and all of our forces to bear on that, then we're able to effect a real change. Awesome.
야 동ар gebjurje troso chipu mchote tetar suwa te lekbar ngo shini te trangbe gaba shuk trala jun tempo jukpa she ngepa de guibe cheke sheba te teda kang tseyang tetar dongar ni dala shindu nyepar kabi thore da tharpi dechi zangla mama drupi tro jachir tsenshen son di dadong ya jepar jorwa deni sobchang chodu gabi nete sumarta nale sham sepi shaka ye ladu yin sheba tar tabu nyamdu soru shabdu yang yang samla yik deva kompari chao sa.
Continuing in this vein, the author states, with this, suffering and difficulties can become a help for our spiritual practice. But that alone is not enough. We need to gain a sense of real joy and enthusiasm, inspired by a thorough appreciation for our achievement, and then reinforce this and make it stable and continuous. So with each of the practices outlined above, all of the different ways of using suffering constructively, say to yourself, this suffering has been of tremendous assistance. It will help me to achieve the many wonderful kinds of happiness and bliss which are experienced in the higher realms and in liberation from samsara, and which are extremely difficult to find. From now on, too, I know that whatever suffering lies in store for me will have the same effect. So however tough, however difficult the suffering may be, it will always bring me the greatest joy and happiness, bitter yet sweet, like Indian cakes that are made of sugar mixed with cardamom and pepper. So you follow this line of thought over and over again very thoroughly and get used to the happy state of mind that it brings.
Hola sta tela tini tsobo karsa gorko ngaranzo eni yang dongar de da tamchi penata ngaranzo ge eni dechik dropper chepala medum rongwa sheta lakbar do tini eni te tabu ge tini tro chegu yaba songzang tini ndela tini chinga su mgaba mayimba ta magobe Dela tini ta ngaran zogo pena, lakwar do ta ngaran zogo pena chik, eni, dongar te da tamje ene tape ene ta deva ta chi na drengen rawo song zang te da tamje la la par do chi ta nga zo ene ya ene ta lam do che tēnā tēnī tēnī tā ngā rā tsō kā rāng tā yēn jē anī tā yā chēmbō tēnī chī drop tōpa lā yā anī mī sē kī yā tēnī kī chī nī yā sēmbā anī pāng tō chī nī tū sī chē gōng rē sō rē.
So what this results in is our attitude changing so that we see all of the suffering that we might experience as being something that's, in a sense, indispensable for our real happiness. And more than that, our real allies and supports in gaining true happiness. So forget about feeling negatively towards the suffering. You should see it as something that's ushering in true happiness for you. That's called carrying suffering on the path. And this kind of practice can achieve enormous results that benefit both you and others. Has enormous meaning in both of those senses. Awesome.
Tētā rā shī pē dēwā yī gē lā kwa rā shī chē pē wāng xē jī dōngā mō ngā mā tā wā sōng tē sēm lā nō mē nē pā nō zō pē nē sēr jī nō pē zöbi ne sergi nöbi tse yinla dina drande so sergi nöbi tse kyang shibar jao sa.
By reflecting like this, our minds will be so suffused with happiness that the suffering we feel through the senses will become almost imperceptible and incapable of disturbing our minds. This is the point at which sickness can be overcome through forbearance. It's worth noting that this is also an indication as to whether difficulties brought about by enemies, harmful spirits, and so forth can be overcome.
Ongo shepi donga la mendo bindu hi doba ne donga lamda longwe tenji yende zeri pro chisendo zeri pro she zeri pro she zeri pro she jir tro yendo donga lamda longwa munubi charo sa.
As we've already seen, reversing the attitude of not wanting to suffer is the whole basis for transforming suffering into our spiritual path. And this is because we simply won't be able to turn suffering into the path as long as anxiety and irritation continue to eat away at our confidence and disturb our mind. So the text goes on to state, the more we arrive at actually transforming suffering into the path, the more we will enhance and reinforce all our previous practice. This is because our courage and good humor will grow all the more once we can see from our own experience how suffering causes our spiritual practice and qualities to blossom. Awesome.
다 참참나 따다 ngaran 저거 되니 야 롭종 때 속고 나한테 되니 송도와 빼나 되니 랑나 되니 찌 가서 동아리 첨보라고 지 경보에 값sos 다 대게 토라 다동양 애니 예 탐제지 동아리 탐제양 랑니 다 가레선 거 다데 나에 되니 동아리인데 다 빼는 디나 예 영에 생제 빠드메 망보여 봐 다 대탐제 그 동아리 탐제야 되네 나에 되네 지 가서 애니 고쳐그 여삼에 고쳐그 여삼에 그 동아리 탐제 서로 당을 라네 양 대라지 예나 빼나 랍지 먹고 팬도 옆에 그 로덥지야 제용 그랬어 되네 인상 되네 랑가야 동아리에서만 네바 매바다야 대라지 가라서 그야 닌돔라고 예배게 삼모지 야드네 쇼경보 제트베 드레지 용고요래라.
In the so-called Lojong teachings of training the mind in the Mahayana, we often see the advice that when you experience some really great suffering yourself, the best thing you can do as a practitioner at that point is to say, now may all of the suffering that others are feeling be lumped in with this, and may my suffering serve to free them from their suffering. Because It's a question of acknowledging that while you're suffering greatly yourself, there are so many countless other beings who are suffering as much as you or more. And in some way, your aspiration is that your suffering and taking on their suffering is something that will be effective in removing their suffering, freeing them from it. So this kind of mental training is something that brings about a great power of mind, such that your own suffering is not able to affect you as much, and your compassion for others grows enormously.
다 tel라 되네 빼나 특바 팀에 로병원 나라 다비 연지지 삼로 쓰도
Mm-hmm.
빼나 다 상지게 남터게 나라야 되네 제지 신간рем비 되네 냐발라 다 장교 스마트니 공부했다 제베 값서 되네 공부다 되게 다지 동안 세매발라고 되더니 지 여봐 되네 공부 될 되네 다 공부 까마 로바 인사요. 저 까마 로바 선다 지콩 일을 때네 거기 때네 콩라 되게 다비 연제제 로드 제네 다 나라 이자 코르네 깔레 다 동할 첨보지도 근데 소다 다코 데발 땅네 때네 코기 때네 되게 다 빼데 이니 까와테 녜 골 때네 때네 때탐지 사망아 다기 코기 세와다 냠도 때네 코조페 가르세 되게 any nyarwil hente trene teni sosu gale teni sola teni ngato te cheji or se teni ngola thawaji shine dela teni konga le tamche ame de changni teni sumchu ta song la ya ji song ba yore de na ye pena ta davi yinji ge teni pena te ta keji che ba samji ge teni te drabo le ame de changni teni tenre ge ta yang pe any 대나 이게 다 가서 자침보더니 다다가 리브 자침보 토픽이 답에 로지 여러 와다 빼나 대답을했어.
So in the Mahayana systems of training the mind, great emphasis is placed upon cultivating this attitude of cherishing others more than yourself. And this brings to mind the account of the previous lifetimes of the Buddha Shakyamuni, back to the time when the being that would become the Buddha Shakyamuni was in a state of hell and was forced by the denizens of hell to, with a companion, to drag a heavy chariot or cart by hand. And the being that would become the Buddha had a moment in that hellish rebirth of feeling compassion for their companion and saying to the denizens of hell that were controlling them, saying, let my companion rest, I'll take on all the work myself, which only enraged the denizens of hell who were guarding them, and they said everybody needs to do what they're assigned to do, and they, in some accounts, they actually bashed the future Buddha on the head and killed that being, and that being's consciousness was immediately reborn in the God's realm of the 33 gods, which was the beginning of the Buddha's process of eventually attaining enlightenment. It was that single instant of compassion for someone else. So there are many such accounts that indicate that even a single moment of bodhicitta, of that altruistic and compassionate concern for others, is something that has enormous effect and brings about a great result. Awesome.
나서라 다 지당게 ngaran 속에 직나지 동해리나 강해리나 가래이나 다 대소 탐지 애니 다 소수기 지 애니 람체르생에다 애니 다 대탐지 빼는 쪼고데 랑게 되니 데데 개쳐 보시브레도스 랑게 다지 마 애니 다지 셈 로톱라고 세거로 셈 로톱지 고니 되니 대탐지를 거서 마 애니 냐마차바티네 대소 탐지를 파르 서지노 토바치야데 개쳐 버려도스 빼는 거는 저거 애니 다 ngazu ngoma 되게 어려워 디 가르세 거고 코로나기 나차들이 나차 깨다 전부터 포르드가 코로나 세마네 코로나
Oh, COVID. Oh, yeah.
코로나기 되니 나차 깨다 전부터 포르드 로호 메조 망보 다 가르세 저랑 나차데 포도세드 세와 점게 쫙네 되니 빠드쳐서 코서 내 마이 바코 셰타 쩌니 Then walk down Mutoba Chan hit or was.
Oh, oh.
Carrier, that Kotu get up at the Jester, that native get a chess or
Mm.
caught in the bed, the Jester tap and in a pod Savatamjik. Tenecope Halam die. Any sheta joke, the Kashit up and then he shares on a ranking as a walk down to me. When I said, Tom the Jens and I just told her, then I'm saying also trying to yellow or tease on the then it take a photo better than a mambo jet, the nigga go at any shit or
So when we consider all the suffering and problems and difficulties that we experience, the ability of any given individual to, quote, carry these on the path depends entirely on the individual's personal strength of mind. Because if you have enough strength of mind, then any of those problems can't overwhelm you. And in fact, you can deal with them and effectively eliminate them. I'm reminded of the fact that during the COVID pandemic, I'm told that there were many cases of people who upon being told that they had COVID, immediately thought of it as a death sentence. And in fact, it hastened their death because they were so afraid and upset. It actually inhibited their ability to become cured of it. It's a bit like when you have a sudden shock, it can frighten you so much you have a heart attack and die. And so apparently there were many cases of people who died not simply because, but because having contracted the disease, having been told it, because the disease was so infamous at that point as being an agent of death, people took it to be a death sentence, and it actually hastened their end because they just gave up. They just said, "Oh, there's no way I'm going to get, I've got it. I'm dying." And in some cases, they just were unable to breathe because they were so upset, not specifically because they had COVID, but because they were so upset. They died of that.
Oh, yes. Any? Guy is it? Diane Kashi, any take up so any ten I get that Nasa support said Nyoba Rawa Chag, any Sempe, Medeva Chabat, Mangodo.
Mm.
When at the Naranzo, Annie Gomba the Sonal, that caused it to pour your day. Cause it that Nasa to pour your by Higa your Martang, as someone's again. 다 포여 바시나 고소 망보지 시에는 되니 제 깔에 차그라 아니
Mm.
가서 참바라고 레슨을 배드 제서를 되니 배드 상황 속에도 고소 나다도 포여 바 시그여 말이 당 참바라고 이마도 되니 양 된다고 시라이 가르스고 앙자데 마제베 송자 되니 코라베 라이가 릴하와 제로도와
Uh,
되니 지당 나저 그 되니 베 다다 애니 나저 되니 남중 그베 디탐지 동herda kanger khare chone zere maje ba sengi ji dowa ta tela pena
mm.
edi lamcher ta tela koso pena phal taro ya thongchong tang che ne yana chur lamde che ne gebe ki tholab jor yana ngara so go te tam che ning doblo jor o ta tindisi koso nga lo yang phal ji che thonghe ji chage yorese.
Now, I remember that during the pandemic, the nunnery was affected. There were people who contracted it, but we didn't make a huge deal of it. In fact, we just sort of said to them, well, you just got a bad cold. And I think part of the problem is in making such a huge deal out of things, we make them more serious than they actually are. It's easier to deal with if we don't fly into a panic and make something a bigger deal than it is. So this is why in his text, Jigme Kembe Nima is saying, don't react to suffering with anxiety and worry and obsession. Rather, use it skillfully. Use it to develop your will to be free of samsara, to develop your inspiration to engage in positive action, to develop your compassion and so forth. By just reacting to it with anxiety, all we do is make it worse. But we can use it skillfully in ways that are to our advantage. Also.
Yang tinsam namso lama konjo la donga lamdu lome che de soban daba ta loyo tu kyungse che de sona konjo dan yungbo che ne daga gyejor je tsar jongwe tsa jenge tongshi ji lepjor cha shen dir namyan trogi dengse da dembar chao sa.
So he says it's said that by training gradually with smaller sufferings, step by step in easy stages, then in the end we'll be able to handle big suffering and difficulties too. We must go about it like this because it's extremely difficult to have an experience of something which is beyond our level or capacity. And in the breaks between our practice sessions, he says, pray to the Lama and the Three Jewels that you may be able to take suffering onto your path. Really aspire for that to be the case. And when your mind has grown a little bit stronger, then make offerings to the Three Jewels and to negative forces and say, please send me, you insist, please send me misfortune and obstacles so I can work on developing the strength of my practice. At the same time, however, he advises us always stay confident, cheerful, and happy.
Oh, that is. Okay, so 이제 뭐만 가르쳐야 되네. top 아니 공 링게 레바 인사요.
Oh, listen.
맞지? 링게 레바 인사요. 다 콩라 되네. 다 나차 되네. 망보보. 다 빠져 로 망보라 되네. 깽에 되네. 망보 퇴 되네. 제도와.
Uh-uh.
네, 다 되네. 되네. 야콩 때서래 자르도 양콩가 라마 건조서 채소를 닝게 민독웨스. 다양 대보고 내 자르고다고. 다체로서는 네바요는 내통 동통 에네코 베데스 다 콜로 베데체스 세네 양 함부 로코 레레체데 양 콜레 나사도스 동동로스 양티 마체 데네 콩고 다동양세 다코 베데체스 sem게 탐지 딕바다 동할 탐지 양 콜 미니 코 냐발라 통효스 되니? 다 들리더니 양도 제거도.
Mm-hmm.
근데 로표스 저기 일을 인사를 되니 그 나자 탐지 랑이가 자 되니 지금은 다 공부 소문도 아까 당에 뭐는 게 자고요스 당가 semje 탐지 치도 가 되니 냐발라 되니 고소 마야다 가서 똥효서 똥히로 똥으로 치세 당가 냐발은 로로 제거 여사 말이 생겨 레와들 누구 여사 말이세 당에 남한테 신간 마도 다지어 나는 믿으세요.
There's the famous case of a Mahasiddha, a greatly accomplished master in Tibet. I think Rinpoche said it was his name was Lingje Repa. But in any case, it is a famous historic case of someone who was always sick and always having problems and difficulties, on and on and on for many years. But his attitude toward it was to always pray to his Lama and the Three Jewels to send more. He would say, if you've got any compassion, make me sicker. And when he would start to get a little bit better, he'd pray and he'd say, oh, my Lama, Three Jewels, have you no compassion? I'm getting better. Bring it on. And so he would actually make these kinds of aspirations. And he would say, not only me, let me take on all of the negative karma and all of the suffering of all sentient beings and send me to hell. And he prayed like this again and again. And over a 10-year period, he gradually got better. He was cured of all his illnesses. He didn't have to seek any treatment. It just kind of happened automatically. But then his ironical comment was, oh no, I guess my prayers weren't answered. I'm not going to get sent to hell. In fact, I think I'm in a Pure Land now. So he had undergone this transformation, but only after he'd gone through this whole process of treating his suffering in this way.
아니 랭에 그 조세 아니 대탐지 그 젠세 차도 되는 가서 아니 가르세 냐발 제거서는 뭐 잡내야 되네 제들이 제요 말마 제요 말마 냐와야랑 나래 되니 어다 된다고랬어.
Because once someone like him had completely exhausted all the negative karma in his makeup, he was completely free of suffering. And even though he may have prayed to go to hell, there was no way in hell, so to speak, that he could. Because hell is nothing but the mind's own perceptions. It's not a place. It's the mind's own perceptions. And when your mind is purified of all of the causes of negativity, it can't experience hell. So you can pray to go to hell and you won't. You can't. Listen.
당본 로빈 던저 주스니 곰바 지에테 던저 셉드 동할 Donghar tang nyema la sopa kalab zu sebi dronge mangwe shen gowa tang dranye longkyo la tembe semchar mangbu sheba nyoshen wangme de chokni lang la chowa tang deli yanyang yingwe jen nazo ji choni roshen wenbi neso teda mepi rikpa shinda tang la 대예 왕게 로코바 라비차르 교요르바 남제 동할 투지체 이게 종아나 당본 던즈 낭도 미니바 던즈 낭도 미 너바라 테니 종아 야데 도트 녀사 웬바 란디 촘촐라 테니 종아 소버치비 점선양 데옌바 히에도사
The author then notes, when you first begin this training, it is vital to distance yourself from ordinary social activities. Otherwise, caught up in everyday preoccupations and busyness, you will be influenced by all your misguided friends who are asking questions like, how can you bear to put up with so much suffering and so much humiliation? Besides, the endless worrying about enemies, relatives, and possessions will cloud our awareness and upset our minds beyond all our control, so that we inevitably go astray, sliding into bad habits. Then, on top of this, we'll be swept away by all kinds of distracting objects and situations. But in the solitude of a retreat environment, since none of these are present, your awareness is very lucid and clear, and so it's easy to make the mind do whatever you want it to. It is for this very reason that when practitioners of Chud train in what is called trampling right on top of suffering, at the beginning they put off doing the practice using the harm caused by human beings amidst distraction, but instead make a point of working with the apparitions of gods and demons in cemeteries and other desolate and powerful places. Listen.
La sola, tab dordina, dongar tamke noba, dongar tamke je semla munoba maze, teda deva yigi, ren topar chebala, nang neta tse jande ta tangwela sokpa teda mundobi namba, charwa kati yigong namba, konana chavala logu sa.
At this point, our author sums up. He says, not only so that your mind will not be affected by misfortune and suffering, but also to be able to draw happiness and peace of mind out of these things themselves, what we need to do is this. Do not see inner problems like illness or outer troubles like rivals, spirits, or scandalous gossip as something undesirable and unpleasant, but instead simply get used to seeing them as something pleasant and delightful. Awesome.
Hola, so ta teang tene machi ge tene muntum ba trosu cher. Tene tienge yangso le nre trobo de te saba tab tene ta tene ki yimba res. Machi ge muntum ba kyo ge na muntum ba tam chi tsuru trosu cher. Tienge tiso tam ki yangso le ta nre tiso trobo de te se oda tu si song yo res. 다 대소 배도 조 당아 조양 배나 이니 다 조 다다 이니 람치르게 양가 첨보지래도 와.
This brings to mind a quotation from the Chud teachings of the one mother, Machik Labdran, who was the founder of the Chud tradition. In these teachings, she says at one point, anything that is counterproductive is your friend. Any ill omen is a sign of prosperity. Any demon is your ally. So the key point here that this is bringing out is how crucial it is to be able to transform our perception of circumstances and so-called, quote, carry them on the path. Awesome.
대웅와라 년세 때다 견지 초소 따와 까진 연대도 따와는 매바 탐제지 러브 요리 이동와 요리 이공 이민네 른증 솔라 똑바데 배는 든지 니메기 초니 망도 삼니 호다 롱교라 속바 제삼 예바 대삼지 순항체를 로신 든들라 편연도 따와 남지 nga tang jeba yingmo sunche jeba yenos.
To accomplish this, we need to stop looking at harmful circumstances as problems and make every effort to view them as beneficial. After all, whether a thing is pleasant or unpleasant comes down to how it is perceived by the mind. Take an example. Someone who continually dwells on the futility of ordinary mundane preoccupations will only get more and more fed up as their wealth or circle increase. On the other hand, someone who seeks worldly affairs as meaningful and beneficial will seek and even pray to increase their power and influence.
Teater lob jung junjang kong yang ronab de kong pa chula pa che me jengen tam che parta trashik chosu char da de hibit dewa jut sambam jong de ning me tu so lam dropa na gochan dem tab me de ye mrongo sa.
With this kind of training, then, our mind and character will become more peaceful and more gentle. We will become more open and more flexible. We will be easier to get along with. We will be courageous and confident. We will be freed from obstacles that hinder our dharma practice. We will be able to turn any negative circumstances to our advantage, meet with success, and bring glory and auspiciousness. And our mind will always be content in the happiness born of inner peace. To follow a spiritual path in this degenerate age, we cannot be without armor of this kind.
Hola so ta di song de kapsa tene tata ngai tata di truko ojen chem chodan tene kembo kama tsepten tene kong na ban rawo ji tene ta nga su ge ji dran yo do ta kong na ba ngani tani ta ten rawo res.
When I reflect upon these teachings, Rinpoche said, I can't help but be reminded of the great masters I knew, such as Tulku Urgyen Chemchok and Khenpo Tseiten, who were really like this. This is how they actually were.
O teye tse zere donghar mepe wanga donghar yen namcha mame laksha lo wan taban rowa mazi ne so chang pache ranglo dan rote ngonje tamba kanda mga bala yigde maje pa maje pi sem mincho te mancho pi long mincho te wanga lujim yungwa yen mincho te chang sem mincho bala sukpa dewi kolo khobar songbi tabung garma chena chala chanam la nya batar jigbi rangi chena de nam je chang la tsar la shin ngang temba namla topar kabar songbali shi so
Yang chi truk so me. Yang yegemindu.
ale
Konda. Detar lo jombe jujang. Mare mare de that's our song. Nyik me dusalam. De se zere dungal mepe wangi dungal jenam chang mak me
re
laksha
re
dunga. Dere ba? Oh, that's so.
re
Okay. That's so. Because if we're no longer tormented by the suffering of anxiety and irritation, not only will other kinds of suffering fade away, like soldiers who've lost their weapons, but even misfortunes like illness will, as a rule, vanish on their own. The saints of the past used to say, if you're not unhappy or discontented about anything, then your mind will not be disturbed. Since your mind is not disturbed, they would say, the subtle energy is not disturbed. This means that the other elements of the body will not be disturbed either. As a result, your mind will not be disturbed, and so it goes on as the wheel of constant happiness turns. Lasso?
laso la ta te ta nang khipa ne chi do tham chi sem la ra le par thone de chi sem chi ten ni so la chi gu chi ge go so ran la chang wi choro
Oh,
la
yeah.
ra ma le ran sem chen ma yi pe no pa kang ge chang zir me pe chi bi che yang
Mm-mm.
yesu ra ma so yin de Tu tado Raman Topa Yeno, Changcho Samba, Chue Tamke, Dever no be Tingen Zayan, Detar the Dropa Yente, Lumbo ne, Dechi Churorji Yola Sordo Red Jogni, Tela ne, Chik Chechong Kang, Dropjang, Wang Mela Choto, Shingla Savatar Soni, Male Patang, Manzon Patang, Chub Matek Balaso, Toda Macheva Kona Manshi, Dra, Kuma Soga. Nobi ladang jeba, niendo jungze re chang, charni drowe, charo ge kubyo ge po chesam su jan rang ge po ong mesik bata, yikde mrong pa shata du sebi, la obje re nyomo pa, rang do nga ba shili mete, ne jang ga che du travi hingdam yeno.
There's also a proverb that says, horses and donkeys with sores on their back are an easy prey for scavenging birds. Similarly, people who are prone to fear are easy victims to negative spirits. But this is not the case with those whose character is stable and strong. Thus it is that the wise, seeing that all happiness and suffering depend upon the mind, will seek their happiness and well-being within the mind. Since all the causes of happiness are entirely within themselves, they will not be dependent on anything external, which means that nothing whatsoever, be it sentient beings or anything else, can do them any harm. And even when they die, this attitude will follow so that they will always, always be free and in control. This is just how the bodhisattvas attain their meditative stabilization, or samadhi, which is called overwhelming all phenomena with bliss. However, foolish people chase after external objects and circumstances in the hope of finding happiness. But whatever happiness they do find, great or small, it always turns out like the saying that says, "You're not in control, it's all in others' hands, just as if your hair were caught up in the branches of a tree." What you'd hope for never comes to be. Things never come together, or else you make misjudgments and there is only one failure after another. Enemies and thieves have no trouble harming you, and even the slightest false accusation will separate you from your happiness. To use an analogy, however much a crow looks after a baby cuckoo, it can never turn into a baby crow. In the same way, if all of your efforts are misguided and based on something unreliable, they will bring nothing but fatigue for the gods, negative emotions for the spirits, and suffering for yourself. This heart advice brings together 100 different essential instructions in one crucial point.
Ola so ta lam drupi kangarji kapche ji dongar tang de len lo tang shibje li shepe so ne don lam chep ji menga yen mang de yo chen den dongar tang ne che chep sa phakwa shiwa la ta ti jim rang ke pi yong la ten go de ber she to sa.
Now, the author notes there are many other pith instructions on accepting suffering and hardships in order to practice the path, and on transforming illness and destructive forces into the path, as taught, for example, in the pacifying or Shije tradition. But here, in a way that's easy to understand, I have given a general outline of how to accept suffering based on the writings of the noble Shantideva and his wise and learned followers.
Ola so ta te so tam je tin nga zo be che tang ge ta lo jung ge menga mang bo yor ba ta te so na ne mi se ta ta nga zo ene ta ta shiwa la ge jon jo la su ba te so ge na la tini. Tā tā ngā tsū māmbō chī sōng yorwa, tā tā sō nāna pē chī ngā mī sēngi. Nī, tā tā sō tam jīla tā dōng yāng tīni, chē nāmbā kī tā tōpa yīna tīni yāpo yorwa sī, tā tā ngā tsū pē nā sō sō kī. Nī, kyōng yāng tā sō xēdāng kī kyōng tā jāmbā lā sōpa kī tīni, pēyōng lā sōpa tā. Nī tā sō tam jīla zē tōp nā yāpo yorwa sī.
Now, as our author notes, there are many, many kinds of instructions, all of which contribute to what is called lojong in Tibetan, or training the mind. And he particularly here notes his source being Shantideva, who of course was the famous author of the Bodhicharyavatara, Entering the Way of the Bodhisattva. But there are many more elaborate discussions of these principles of using negative circumstances as your allies and supports, of using them to develop love and compassion and so forth. And Rinpoche said, if you have the opportunity to look further into these and do more reading and study, I would encourage you to do so. It will only reinforce your conviction that such is the case. Awesome.
Tene Shivalagi, Teneji Dwas, Penata, Milchig Chola, Jokwaji Shiona,
Mm-hmm.
Tene Chutini Jukwatela, and Jukwati Shigodwa, Chana Jukwatela, Tene Control Malan, Mittel Control Karate Langados, Jukwati Shusonse. Yunayang, Tene Chog Shagres, Jukwatela Kayo Mare. Jukwati Tene Miti Shubat, Tene Songa Mittel Control Langados. 아니 콩게 오나 미테야 미테 찍바레세 콜라 라왕께 요 마레스 코 콩로디 베오레스 데데 카르테 콜 콩로 랑고 요나 코기 양테니 콩로 데라테니 테 나주 콩로 고도스
Mm. There's one case in Shantideva's writings where he uses the example of somebody who is beaten by somebody else using a stick or a club. And he poses a question, the hypothetical question to this person, and he says, why are you angry at the person and not the club? It was the club that hit you, not the person. And the person, the victim says, but the club had no control over the situation. It was the person controlling the club. To which Shantideva replied, the person wielding the club is in the same position. They have no control. They're being controlled by their anger. So if you're going to hate anything, hate the anger. The club had no control. The person had no control. The anger was in control of everything. That's what you should be focusing on.
데니 다 카르테 코 콩로 랑나야 chögel tene lende chög par tene kongro de la malo na ku kongro je lani tene chöpe de kesere tene ani ta chöla dugaje lawana chörang tene chörang kongro ku par lende malo na tene kogti pa karse ko longda wore se ti kogta chöra dugare senge de nge dabo majemna tene nawa yini ko nawa yoni pa tang yana tene ko ni pa khaye yo mare se te char 다 데르 초랑 그 콩로데 다고 얍 데네 체랑이데 데네 투바데 숄더도와
Mm. His advice at that point was, if you take the anger that arises in you when you're hit by somebody, for example, using this hypothetical situation when the person clubs you, and you get angry in return, that only compounds the problem. But in fact, the anger is not something in and of itself that you have to own. It's like the wind. It doesn't belong to anybody. It just comes and goes. So he said, if you just let it pass without reacting and investing anger with a solidity it doesn't have, then it's finished with. But if you react with your own anger, all that does is fuel the other person's, and it just gets worse and worse. But he said anger is not like that. You can just let it go, and it's nothing in and of itself. It'll just go like the wind just passes by you and is gone. Awesome. Awesome.
데네 양 시와라 가레 송요르 세네르바
Mm.
다 디감지 빼 나랑소 그 데네 다 에니 체다 나온다 다 데네게 데네 아니 뇨라 드라도 데네 빼 망보 요르바
Mm.
빼나 데 탐지 가르르세나 빼나 다 나랑소 그 에니 데네지 송이도아 데 탐지 데네 나랑소 그 데네 도야게 데네 직 아니 빼깔래카보레 탑이요 말레스 빼는
Mm-hmm.
가서 그더니 사기 탐지 빼는 당 알아서 그 아니 직내 깡발라 되는 가서 아니 너 용어도 쓰는 사기 탐지 가서 꼬아기 요는 요 두고 말레스 대나게 랑가 깡바 찍고 거서 막 꼬아기 요 야나더니 사 탐지 요 받아 찍바래 근데 sonda ngarang ge sem chig de thor sona dra de tham che tene nga so thor wa de chig ba re so ma re se
Mm-hmm. Another famous example that Shantideva used was with respect to all of the problems and difficulties that we face in life on the outer level, inner level, everything. When we tend to give up and say there's nothing we can do about it, we're like somebody saying, the surface of the earth is covered with so many stones and rocks and thorns, it'll hurt my feet. The only way I could deal with it is to cover the whole earth with leather, and I can't do that. But Shantideva points out all you have to do is put on shoes. All you have to do is cover your feet with leather, and it's effectively the same as if the whole earth was covered with leather. The point being, if you tame your own mind, that takes care of everything. So rather than trying to fix external circumstances, if we simply work with our own minds, that accomplishes the same thing. Just to summarize, the basic principles that are being outlined here are that whenever we feel happiness, this has more to do with the end of the text, whenever we feel happiness, we should regard it as due to the kindness of the three jewels and not something we sort of congratulate ourselves about. But rather we should understand that the reason we are experiencing that happiness is because of positive and virtuous actions that we have done in the past. And that is defined as that which brings benefit in the true sense of the word to ourselves and others. And so any happy experience we have should be an impetus for us to further that by engaging in more and more virtuous behavior, positive behavior. It's said that the one thing you should never be contented about is your virtue. You can never do enough. So don't think, oh, that's enough. It never is. And as far as suffering goes, again, as we've seen in the text that we covered tonight, the whole point is not to let it overwhelm you, but use it as a way to train and develop positive qualities such as your will to be free from samsara, your bodhicitta and compassion for other beings, an encouragement to yourself to further pursue virtuous activity. So the whole point of carrying things on the path is the ability to relate to them skillfully and work with them, regardless of whether it's a nominally positive experience or a nominally negative experience. If we're happy, we shouldn't let that happiness draw us into feeling proud of ourselves, feeling like we're somebody special. On the other hand, if we're suffering, we shouldn't make it feel like we're somebody miserable, that we're a terrible person, and lose kind of our self-confidence and so forth. So that's the basic principle behind what's being called carrying happiness and suffering on the path. And that I just wanted to say that as a final note. Rinpoche said that this is the kind of the crucial principle that's being talked about here. So thank you very much.